This is a Film Stories original podcast.
If you own a vehicle with less than 200,000 miles and have an auto warranty about to expire or no warranty coverage at all, listen up. CarShield has a low-cost month-to-month vehicle protection plan that covers more parts than ever. Visit carshield.com/audio to find out how you could pay almost nothing for covered auto repairs. Drivers who activate this vehicle protection today will also receive free roadside assistance, free towing, and car rental options at no additional cost. Get your free quote today at carshield.com/audio. That's carshield.com/audio.
We made this.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Xcast. This is not happening. My name is Kurt North and welcome along to our continuing coverage of Season 8 of The X-Files. If you're sick of me by now, I promise I will not be on the next episode. I will promise that. I will not be on the next episode. Season 8 is not a favourite season of mine. I am not going to be on it anymore. Maybe I might be on later. Joining me today is a returning guest who has been on Season 8 previously. It's Darren Mooney. Darren, welcome back. How are you doing?
Hello. I'm sure that all the listeners appreciate your promise that will not be happening next week.
That will definitely not be happening next week, and I can 100% guarantee that because it's recorded and and I am not on it, so, which is great. How are things? You okay?
I'm good. How are yourself? How is
good.
Yourself? Darren is it's very warm here, so my brain may overheat. Just in case listeners get any word salad.
Yeah, I think when we did Fight the Future Minutes, we've had this issue before. I think we've been very hot recording in the middle of
very
July.
Hot on this podcast. Well, you're always very hot, Kurt. Thank you.
Well, Sarah likes a balding man, so I think we're both in good company. So Sarah will be all over this podcast, I would have thought. So the bald eagle, as she likes to call Skinner. So
the big problem, I think, for Sarah with this episode is the fact that, like, when Scully knocks on Skinner's door, he says, "Wait, let me put some clothes on." Other than that, I think that this would be a 10 out of 10 episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that links us directly straight into This Is Not Happening. It's a very interesting episode. It was Season 8, Episode 14, and it aired on the 25th of February 2001. Written by Chris Carter and Frank Spotnitz and directed by Kim Manners. 2 in a row as well, Darren. So let's just go dive straight into this because I think there's quite a lot to discuss with this episode. It's straight after Permanum. Permanum I talked about last week with Carl and Cortlan and the production elements of moving things around and stuff.
Yes,
but
yeah.
There's a lot of serialization just about to kick in and has already started here. So what do you make to coming out of Medusa, coming into this run now, and your general thoughts on This Is Not Happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of alluded to it when I talked to Sarah about, I think it was Without we talked about. But I think, like, one of the interesting things about the 8th season as a whole, and one of the reasons why I love it so much, even though it doesn't necessarily have any episodes that are as good as, say, the best episodes of Season 4 or Season 6, even, if it's doesn't have as many of them as, say, Season 3 or Season 5, one of the reasons that I do keep coming back to Season 8, and one of the reasons I'm a huge Season 8 fan, is in large part because it feels like a season of television that is actually structured to be greater than the sum of its individual parts. And in particular, it is a season of television that is structured so that it has a very clear 3-act structure. So you have the start of the season, the run of the season that begins with Within and then stretches depending on whether you're going, again, as you discussed last week, depending on whether or not you're going by production order or by broadcast order, it runs to about Via Negativa or Permanum, depending on which order you're watching in. And then you have like the second act of the season, which is, 5 episodes from like Sure Kill to Medusa, which is like largely, okay, so this is the new status quo. This is Doggett and Scully and they're going to solve X-Files together. And here with This Is What Not Happening, you have an episode that is very clearly structured to function as a transition point from the second act of the 8th season into its third and final act. If you are listening to this episode, I assume that you have, are at least vaguely aware of the fact that maybe a major character is returning to the show in some serious capacity. I find it very unlikely that you've gotten this far into the X-Cast without kind of being aware of that. But
You're being dead serious there. Darren, you're being dead serious.
It's a real alive wire when you kind of touch on that, I think. I'm not going to be outfoxed on this. But I do think that, you obviously you have the point where this is kind of like the Empire Strikes Back of the X-Files season 8. This is the moment that takes the characters to their lowest points dramatically. Everybody loses absolutely everything. There's a moment where it really feels like this is where everything could hypothetically align and come together. Everybody could come within inches of having the happy ending that they want and that we want for them, but they watch it fall in slow motion, kind of slip through their fingers and end up at a point of complete and utter desperation where, not only do they have answers to the questions that they've been asking across this run of the season, but those answers are not the ones that they would want. And again, one of the big tensions of This Is Not Happening, one of the things I really love about it, and we'll talk about it when we talk about the episode in a bit more depth in a moment, but it's this idea that knowing is different than not knowing. That not knowing where Mulder is, while that's terrifying and unsettling and nightmarish and, any number of things could be happening, at least while you don't know where Mulder is, there's the potential for a happy and satisfying resolution. And This Is Not Happening is for me, a really great episode of television and a really perfect episode of this season, because it's an episode that is largely about how knowing what happened to Mulder, how physically recovering Mulder doesn't necessarily provide a happy ending, how closure in some ways can be as bad or worse than the uncertainty of not knowing. I absolutely love this episode. I love so much about it. I love the fact that it is so dark, visually and thematically. Again, like most of the 8th season, a lot of this is shot at night. Even when it's not shot at night, it was very clearly kind of shot in autumn. It has this nice autumnal kind of feel to it, where even the foliage is kind of brown. A lot of the surroundings are kind of desert and arid. And even the characters, like, say, Doggett and Scully, are wearing a lot of black, even when they're out in broad daylight, such as the sequence where they're meeting kind of Reyes for the first time. I like that there is no antagonist in this story. There's no figure like the cigarette smoking man. Slight spoiler for next week's episode, which, by the way, something that I would probably I don't know if I'd recommend listeners kind of try to implement this themselves, but when this was originally broadcast, This Is Not Happening was the last episode aired during sweeps in early 2001, which meant that there were 5 weeks between this episode of The X-Files and the next. So try to imagine being an X-Files fan in early 2001 when that happens. Also, I would recommend, or just something to think about, is that it was, I believe, in that 5-week gap that you saw The Lone Gunman premiere, which is this quirky, offbeat, kind of happy-go-lucky comedy Mission Impossible homage hour of television. And, I'm not going to stand here and defend The Lone Gunman, unless you invite me back to a podcast where we discuss The Lone Gunman and I get to defend The Lone Gunman. But I do wonder if part of the reaction that, say, X-Files fans and TV critics had to The Lone Gunman on its initial broadcast was largely down to the fact that it was the only X-Files content broadcast after this hour of television right here. But I do love the bleakness of it, but the fact that bleakness is not rooted in villainy. There's no Krychek here. There's no Kirsch here. There's no cigarette smoking man here. Everybody here wants a happy ending. Everybody here is working in the hope that they can make things better. And that somehow makes the tragedy of the episode all the more compelling and all the more unsettling. I absolutely and unequivocally adore this. I think this is one of the highlights of the 8th season, right up there with the Jesus Snail episode.
Yeah, the reason why we're on video call, the reason why I'm sort of moving around is I thought that I'd just have a very quick look at my DVD collection, because I've got Dead Alive and I can't seem to find it on my DVD collection. But the reason why I was going to do that for is that myself here in the UK, we actually had the DVD. So it was actually Dead Alive, the DVD, which had This Is Not Happening and Dead Alive on it. So we didn't have that 5-week gap. We had a DVD which hasn't even aired in the UK yet. So to see that just all in one go, I mean, I can't imagine what it would have been like to see it, and then not have. And obviously, nowadays, Better Call Saul, as we record, has just returned to screens after a brief hiatus.
Which was unbearable. It was not a planned hiatus, but it ended up being an unbearable hiatus. It was amazing. By the way, I wholeheartedly recommend Better Call Saul.
Yes, I would too as well. And I haven't seen the newest episode, but which is I have seen obviously the last episode of the season, of the half season, and I'm going to watch it as soon as I finish this recording. So yes, so it's interesting that they've got that 5-week gap, which is something like Better Call Saul and Stranger Things have had.
Yeah, it's coming back. Like 90s television is coming back, baby. We're moving away from the whole binging model. Even Netflix is again structuring its kind of seasons, and again, like we mentioned that like part of this was down to sweeps. Like part of this was down to the fact that like this had to come out during sweeps because you wanted the audience watching Mulder's return like during sweeps in order to drive up ratings. And again, part of me, I don't know if I'm being condescending by explaining what sweeps is. If I am, listeners, I apologize. But like sweeps was back obviously when you had terrestrial television and you were trying to sell advertising slots. So you would want people to watch during sweeps so that you could use those ratings to go to advertisers and say, pay us large amounts of money to stick advertising in these programs, please. So they're all about like you want people watching your network during sweeps, and this is like this is Fox putting its cards down saying watch this. But the thing about Stranger Things, which I love, and this is something that somebody pointed out to me, the breaking of that Stranger Things season into 2 halves, right? It splits them across 2 financial quarters for Netflix, right?
Right, okay.
Which has had an actual impact on Netflix's stock. The fact that they are releasing Stranger Things Part 2 in the 3rd quarter as opposed to releasing all of Stranger Things in the 2nd quarter has helped like buoy the company's stock. So I love that like even in the digital age, even in streaming, even in binging age, we're still kind of playing the same sorts of games when it comes to like making television. It's just the rules have changed slightly, but the principles remain the same. So that's a tangent upon a tangent. I apologize for that. But I find it
and a further tangent, we've got Star Trek Strange New Worlds going to more episodic television. But anyway, let's move on.
How long do you have? How long are you on for, Kurt?
I've got Better Call Saul to watch before I go to work tomorrow morning, Darren. So I think we'll call that.
We've got about 5 hours then, yeah?
Exactly. So with the DVD, as I say, in the UK, that it would have been released. I think it was released because I remember watching it on the DVD and not on Sky as it would have been over here. And I had both, so I would have seen this early on.
Can I ask you a question then, right? Because obviously you watched that like as a feature film presentation, 90 minutes, beginning to end, the 2 parts back to back, right? Watching it for this discussion, did you watch just This Is Not Happening? And like,
what was on this occasion? Yes.
What was is there a difference for you in watching the 2 of them together and watching this separate on its own? Does it feel different?
It feels different because this is a much better episode.
Kurt won't be back next week.
No, I do like Dead Alive. I just think we'll get to it. We'll get to it when we get to the very end and what we find at the end, just before we head into Dead Alive. But I think there's definitely a point at which part of my X-Files fandom died along with this episode, because it's kind of like the stepping stone to the vertebrae at the end of the season, which I just like think that's my jump the shark moment. So
that's your jump the shark moment.
That's my jump the shark moment. But the Dead Alive moment.
Some
was
neck
close.
On that, eh?
Yes,
I did a little twirly notion because the vertebrae swirls. Slight spoiler out of context.
Yes, you're talking garbage, Darren. They're talking garbage. Yes, anyway, let's get back to my point. So, yes, the 16th of June 2002 is when it aired in the UK. And then the following week, it was 23rd of June. So it was week on week in the UK. So there wasn't that gap, which is in itself interesting. What I wanted to talk about in regards to this, because it's a mythology episode, you talked a little bit, as you say, at the beginning of the season. Relating this to season 3 compared to season 8, season 3, you've got a lot of things going on, a lot of moving parts. You've got the black oil, you've got Krychek running around and all this type of thing. With regards to season 8, it's very stripped back, and one of the things that I find fascinating with season 8 as a whole is that it's very kind of propulsive, but in a very different manner. It's not like sort of, there's no like propulsion like you get in 731, but you get something as visceral as this episode. How do you equate that between the two seasons for yourself? With because season 3 for me is one of my favourite seasons, and this is as well, but they're very different seasons in regards to mythology.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, I think season 3 is my favourite season of The X-Files. I think season 8 is probably either my second or third favourite, depending on how I feel about season 5 in a given moment. And I think the difference between the two, and I guess this is probably, Darren's going to say something controversial now. I think the difference between the two is that I would argue that the third season is largely propelled by theme. To the point where you could argue that, like, the two-parters in there, which are, obviously Nicene 731 and Piper Maroon Apocrypha, are like meditations on the same basic theme. They're both about, like, the legacy of the Second World War. They're both about the idea that there are dark secrets from the Second World War that need to be uncovered. And again, that idea kind of runs through the season, where you can put two individual, like, non-mythology episodes, like Oubliette, for example, which is about this idea of recovering something that you thought was kind of forgotten. Oubliette being a hole, you kind of put it in, that sort of stuff. And Aubrey, the previous season, kind of sets up that idea as well, going back to, I think, the World's Fair is a major plot point in Aubrey, as I recall, as well. And so you have this kind of solid, concrete thematic basis that propels the third season. And like, so that holds it together, even though it's not necessarily hugely driven in terms of kind of plot. You have like the black oil seems to come out of nowhere when you're watching Piper Maroon Apocrypha. It doesn't feel like it's something that was kind of set up across the run of the show. It arguably feels more of a piece with something like Grotesque, which is a standalone episode that's produced around the same time, because you can tell that Carter's kind of bubbling this idea of what is evil and what does evil look like and how does evil impact you. And it's like, okay, well, let's work through that in several scripts simultaneously. What I like about season 8, what I love about season 8 is that it is a much more character-driven season, in terms of, you're right, the mythology is absolutely stripped back to the core. It is the only season of the X-Files, including the revival seasons, in which the cigarette-smoking man does not appear, which is notable and remarkable of itself. It is also a season where the plot is, and again, I think Chris Knowles, past and future guest of the podcast, has kind of talked about this. It's where, like, the mythology in the 8th season becomes very comic booky. You start throwing around worlds like Super Soldier, that sort of thing. And it's the kind of thing where people go, okay, that's very science fiction-y, as opposed to the project or the date or the colonization or these abstract nouns. They become a lot more specific. And the plot itself is very much a 50s science fiction plot. It's Invasion of the Body Snatchers. A slight spoiler for, I guess, the final stretch of the season. But that's where this is going. We're not doing anything more sophisticated than the idea that maybe aliens are among us and they're replacing us and they're going to change us and give us special vertebrae that Kurt really, truly loves. But that's okay, because whereas in previous seasons, I think you could argue that, like, theme was foregrounded and character was derived from theme. Where, like, so for example, Mulder's, like, trauma dealing with Samantha was, like, ruminating on the show's core theme of, like, trauma and the idea of how these things shape us and how these, memories that we have may or may not be reality, and how we process those through constructing narratives around ourselves. And so Samantha becomes a manifestation of theme as much as she is of character. Again, Oubliette is an example of that, where you have Mulder saying, this case isn't about Samantha, even though arguably it very clearly is. Whereas you invert that in the 8th season, and you end up with the idea that the mythology is all about the idea of character and theme, and the idea of Scully's kind of like fear of motherhood, or her anxiety about the idea that she might have to become a mother by herself. She's well capable of doing it, obviously, but she's worried about the idea that Mulder might not be there to help her. So Mulder is quite literally gone and abducted. She's worried about this change that is happening to her body. So Mulder is strapped to a chair and his body is warped and distorted. She's worried about this life form that is growing inside of her. So not only do you have the Jesus slug earlier in the season in Roadrunners, which is a very literal manifestation of what if there was something inside of you and you didn't know what it was, but you also have the more literal rebirth that happens, like, later on in the season, where, like, things are literally growing inside of people and replacing them, which is, again, very much overtly a birth metaphor. And you have this idea that all of this stuff kind of works in service of the core themes of the show. And again, arguably literalizing the drama behind the scenes as well, because, again, this is a very funereal season. This is a season that is, I think, largely about death and about endings. And I think like when I was on, and again, sorry, this is something that's going to drive. If there are people listening to this who don't like me talking nonsense, I apologize. But it's going to drive people who do not like me talking nonsense. It's going to drive them right up the wall. But we talked about, like, if you look at, say, the 7th season, there's this recurring preoccupation with undeath. Things like, say, the zombies in, like, the Millennium episode in Hollywood AD, for example. You know, the shark in Hungry was originally meant to be a zombie. George Romero and Stephen King were supposed to do a remake of Night of the Living Dead. You have this idea of things that are meant to die but won't, but just keep going. And you have like this idea of the zombie conspiracy that is just doesn't have a head anymore, but is just shuffling along. The cigarette smoking man is like dying and practically dead. He's pasty, he's white, he's wasting away. Mulder literally dies and goes to heaven at the start of the season, but still doesn't die. So you have this idea in the 7th season of a show that is fundamentally unkillable, which reflects the idea of the feeling of people working on the show in the 7th season, where this is wrapping up soon. We've done enough X-Files. We can like retire the show at the end of this season. Fox isn't going to greenlight an 8th season, and then they do, and it's like, okay, all right. But there is a sense watching the 8th season of like, no, this is definitely the end of the line, and we understand it's definitely the end of the line for David Duchovny and probably Gillian Anderson. Like, right down to opening with like Doggett producing Mulder's tombstone, Mulder adding his name to the family tombstone. And obviously here, where this episode ends, spoiler alert, I'm hoping you're not listening to this in real time while watching the episode. I'm hoping you've watched the episode already. But it ends with the discovery of Mulder's body, Mulder's dead body. And throughout you have this idea like that's running through of like everybody in this episode knows that like the probability of finding Mulder is going to be finding him dead. Like you have, for example, all the characters talk about fear. They talk about like Scully's fear about what it means to find Mulder, how she can do the stuff that she does while still being afraid. You have Reyes telling her, I know what you're afraid of. And like the idea that like all of this is certainty. I mean, there's that moment where she goes out with Skinner and she looks up at the sky, which is one of the most beautiful moments in the show's run. Again, mirroring another of the most beautiful moments of the show's run from Closure. But you have that moment where she's looking up at the stars. And I always think of that Alan Moore quote from Watchmen, where he's like, all we see of the stars are their old photographs. And the idea that, like, on light, that's where spirits reside. And that's a moment where Scully is all but saying she knows Mulder's dead. She knows that he's gone. She knows that even if she finds him, he's probably not going to be coming back. And so you have this kind of like, and again, wonderfully morbid. It's a really dark direction for a show like this. And again, shout out to Carter and to the production team and to Kim Manners, the director, for like making the show look this dark while shooting in California. I really do love the 8th season bringing back the darkness that you kind of lost in the 6th season. And I mean, I like the 6th season. I like the light aesthetic. I like the move towards comedy. I think that's fine. I think it's interesting. I think they do good things with it. But I also really like that they go very dark here. And it's like watching this, like, you know, as an audience member, that the show's days are numbered. And even if, hypothetically speaking, Fox were to do something crazy, like, I don't know, greenlight a 9th season to the show, you know when you're watching this that, like, Duchovny's definitely not going to be back. Anderson isn't going to want to be back. And you know that, like, the version of the show that it was is dead, is gone. And that this is just an extended opportunity. And again, this is something that I really love about the 8th season. I don't know if I'm going to be on again. But like one of the things I really love about it is that it feels like an extended opportunity to say goodbye to the show. It feels like even when Duchovny comes back, and again, this is one of the interesting things about the show, and when I'm on in the 9th season, it'll be interesting to talk about. But like, it's amazing how the show kind of like flips its perspective so dramatically between the 8th and 9th seasons, where in the 8th season, they're aware of the fact that Duchovny was engaged in a lawsuit like against Fox, naming, I think he labeled Carter as a co-conspirator, and they were well aware that the relationship at that moment in time was probably not going to be healthy or salvageable, and that Duchovny was probably not going to want to come back to work as a regular on the show, particularly when the show was producing 20-odd episodes a season. So in the 8th season, there's a sense of we got one more go. We got one more go with Duchovny. We got 11 episodes with him. We got to make this count. We know that he's not going to be back at the end. And then you watch the 9th season and you're like, You just missed Mulder. He was just here. We swear. He's promised. Come back next week. He'll be back next week. Please tune in next week. He'll be back next week. We promise. And there's a real interesting kind of shift in energy. But I love the 8th season being like, no, you're saying goodbye. And that's something pop culture doesn't do enough, particularly today with its older characters. And rewatching it now, it's something I find deeply moving, where it's like, yeah, we are saying goodbye to Mulder and Scully, even if, spoiler alert, Mulder may not actually be dead for the long term.
Ah, my dearest Darren.
Spoiler. Slight spoiler.
We haven't got to the best part of the show, which I haven't done with yourself for a long time. It's IMDb Guess the Score game.
Damn it, I thought I could distract you.
You try to. You're not going to get away with it, Darren. There's no way I can do this without doing this. Okay, so from 2,600 votes, what do you think this got, and what would you rate this episode yourself?
I am going to throw a wild guess out there. I'm going to say this got an 8.1 is what I'm going to guess. I think it may be slightly higher than the average for the season because the one where Mulder comes back. I think it's season 8, so it's probably still a bit contentious. I'm going to go 8.1.
Not bad at all. You 0.2 out. It's 8.3.
Oh, okay.
Which is out of 10, which is really good. I mean, as you say, it's the return of Mulder. Very angsty, very, as you say, it's quite dark for an episode, but it is the culmination, as you were talking about, the way that this episode is actually done, and part of the illusion to stripping it back and mention the starlight and things, which we'll get into in a second. It is, for me, it's a fantastic episode, and I think that it has that credence to it, that it is whenever I watch it, I'm amazed how visceral and how reactionary it is, and just how good Gillian is in this episode, in particular. So what would you rate it then? Well, if it's 8.3 out of 10 for IMDb, where would you put this in the ether?
It's probably a 9 for me. I think this is probably the last, for me, truly phenomenal mythology episode. I think that, up until arguably Darren Morgan's 2 episodes for the revival, this is probably the strongest episode that the show has from here on out, I would argue, perhaps controversially and perhaps contentiously. But yeah, I absolutely love it. It is, I believe, as the kids say, a mood.
Nice. I would go exactly the same. 9 out of 10. I think it's one of the best last episodes. Essence and existence, even though the vertebrae for me is a bit, I think I'm on essence, I think, is a bit too much for me. And then that's in existence, isn't it? It's the second episode. It's
the teaser, isn't it? It's the teaser to it. Yeah. I don't know. It's been a while, but yeah. It's not quite the spine of the episode, unfortunately.
It's not quite, just not quite. It's almost the spine of the episode. Apart from those two, and potentially my struggle too, then there's not much in the mythology that I really like post this. So, not necessarily but I actually enjoy my struggles in some weird sense, which we'll get there in the years to come.
Stay tuned in 5 years.
Exactly, yeah, we'll be all right. And just wanted to touch on something that you mentioned there about the fact that this is not happening, and then we've got the lone gunman. I wonder if we should maybe do something about the lone gunman. I'll just leave that out there.
Let's throw that out there. You should take like the X-Cast, just put it on hiatus for 5 weeks and just air the entire Lone Gunman season that you made, and just wait for people to get really angry at you about it. Again, like I love, like a part of me loves the kind of like the pettiness of that, where it's like, look, X-Files fans, they're down. They've had possibly the most depressing cliffhanger the show has ever produced. You know what? The world needs to laugh.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting, but we are in plans to do something on the Lone Gunman, if I'm being absolutely honest with you. So we're not going to avoid doing it. I've got them on DVD. I know they're difficult to get hold of, but we will be doing something with them.
I like the way that makes it sound like you have the 3 of them in the room with you. It's like, well, they're going to do something with them. Yeah,
it's like Christina Ricci in Yellow Jackets. I've got them in the basement. So anyway, let's dive more into This Is Not Happening and talk about this in more depth.
Hello, and this is Frame to Frame, part of the We Made This podcast network. We are a podcast that take 2 seemingly unconnected films and slam them together with the most obscure theme that we can find. I'm Andy Williams.
And I'm Sean Wilson.
And every Wednesday, you'll be able to find out a little bit more about the different themes and different films that we look into. You can hear moments such as this.
Gwyneth Paltrow has as many Oscars as David Cronenberg. That's just wrong in every sense of the word.
Yeah, but you can't get a candle that smells like David Cronenberg's. No, wait, I'm not going to go there.
No, don't do that.
I mean, we've done nearly 10 minutes on why you dislike Zack Snyder, and that was just the first person that I mentioned as a talented name within the
now
film.
you've got to take us in a positive direction, please.
Okay. Jared Butler is the lead of this film.
Oh, that's not a good start. That's really not a good start at all. Keep going. I just want to say, I really love your philosophy about no matter how good or bad a movie is, there's a lot of effort that goes into it. I really like that philosophy because I find myself grappling with that. It's kind of like it's really easy to tear something down because the finished product that comes out in the cinema or on streaming is nominally bad, but it has actually had a fair amount of effort that went into it, regardless of how that's planned.
Be sure to check your podcast app of choice every Wednesday to find new episodes. You'll be able to like, subscribe, and find us on social media at Frame to Frame Pod.
Hi, I'm Annabeth Gish, and I play Monica Reyes on The X-Files. You're listening to Xcast.
Just at the top of the hour, just maybe go through some of the actual narrative points rather than actually going into the stuff like the Scully and the Doggett stuff. And that's through Absalom. You mentioned just something that you mentioned earlier on about this episode not really having an antagonist as such. And I find it interesting for me that one thing I've got as an issue with me with modern Star Trek, and even like the Star Trek films themselves, that there's always a nemesis. So, and I actually enjoy things when there's something a bit different. I know the motion picture, for example, in Star Trek is slightly different, and the whales, for example, are good. But there's only so much Nemesis storylines that I can take, and often...
Including Star Trek Nemesis.
Including Star Trek Nemesis, yeah. What I do enjoy, especially with like sort of Jose Chung's from Outer Space, the stuff like that, which doesn't necessarily have it, or the aliens in this are the antagonists, but they're not. They're not
present. They're very much out of the frame.
Yeah, I mean, perfect example is the UFO over the actual hut. It's not really the UFO you're concentrating on. It's Scully getting to Jeremiah Smith, but also the fact that Absalom was in Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. Which I thought, going through my head going, actually, that's interesting.
That's Judson Scott, by the way, one of the most handsome men who ever lived. He just has one of those faces where you're like, yep, that is a very handsome man.
And man, can he cry. But an introduction to him, we will see him in the future. And also allusions in Season 8 as well. We've got things like Via Negativa. We've had Millennium in Season 7. We've had the Millennium TV show as well. Of this we thought that the world was going to end in 2000. It didn't happen. Oh, it's actually going to start again. Something that might happen around 2012 as well. But that formulates some of this story arc. And part of the reason why I wanted to mention Season 3 before was also the tangible links with Season 1. Teresa Halsey. You've got the whole Requiem stuff as well, and then you've got Jeremiah Smith. But the Absalom thing to hold that together and that cult thing. How do you sort of pass all of that aspect to this episode?
Well, it's kind of interesting that you mentioned like Season 1 there, and in many ways you could argue that this is something of a Season 1 in that it's like a light reboot of the X-Files. You strip back a lot of the mythology. There's no longer like the conspiracy, the consortium like at play here. It is, as you said, the aliens operating at the edge of the frame, like the spaceship hovering in the sky, the white light, the guy chasing it, trying to catch it, and all that sort of stuff. And I think what's interesting is that the result of like getting rid of the conspirators, getting rid of the cigarette smoking man, the well manicured man, the first elder, all that sort of stuff, is that it has an interesting effect of refocusing the X-Files on the victims, and again, it's such a cliche, and I apologize, and it's become very much a cliche in recent years as well, to say that something is about trauma as a way of suggesting that it has depth or complexity, or it's more worthy, or any of that sort of stuff, and it's not something I necessarily buy. But I do think that the X-Files is, to use that Jamie Lee Curtis cliche, it's about trauma. But it's about, it's about the idea of something terrible has happened and trying to make sense of it, and it being fundamentally impossible to make sense of it. There's lots of studies that have been written about things like, say, alien abduction, and how, for many people, and they suspect that like these are ways of covering for more mundane sorts of abuses, that these are ways that children's minds process things that children should never have to witness. And again, it's no coincidence that the resurgence of UFO lore in the States overlapped with things like the Satanic Panic, which was a similar sort of thing where it's like these terrible things that are happening are reframed in mythological terms. And again, it's worth noting that, like, when you have, like, people recovered, for example, that when you have that kind of first body, Teresa Jose returned, like, you have the doctor, who's Desai, played by Bernard White, one of those great character actors who pops up absolutely everywhere, but he's talking about what happened to her like it was a case of, like, abuse or violence. He talks about how she was kind of brutalized and how she was scarred and cut and carved in a way that feels like he's talking about a serial killer more than he's talking about aliens. I mean, Scully asks him, did you detect any foreign objects? And he's like, no, I didn't. And you have this idea, like, even the way in which she's presented with, like, the bruises on her face and things like that kind of suggests a more mundane sort of kind of trauma that has happened to her. And again, it reminds me a lot of, and again, going back to the first season, things like, say, Max Fenwick, for example, and the way in which Fenwick was presented as this character who had this terrible, terrible thing happen to him, and people who refused to believe that it had, and how he'd kind of ended up basically isolated, alone, and kind of disconnected from the world as a result of that. And you could argue the same thing happened with Mulder and the disappearance of Samantha, and even early episodes like Conduit kind of lean into that. And then as the show develops and as you get to know the conspirators, as you spend more time with, you know, Bill Mulder and the cigarette smoking man, as Mulder himself gets more folded into the conspiracy through blood relations, through prophecy, through all that sort of stuff, you end up losing a lot of that, and it becomes more fixated on the people who perpetrate these crimes than on the victims of them. And I do like that in the 8th season in general, but in This Is Not Happening in particular, because the aliens and the colonists are, again, literally alien, because they are put at a remove from what is happening. You do have this focus instead on the people who kind of do suffer. You know, I mean, in the last episode that aired, for example, you had, what's her name, Megan Follows, who I believe was Anne of the Green Gables, like giving birth to an alien, like, for example. Sorry?
Yeah, the reason why I'm laughing is because Cortlan, Carl and I weren't really au fait with that aspect of it. And Sarah said, basically, make sure you mention that, make sure you mention that, make sure you mention that. And we all went, we don't know what you're talking about, Sarah. So she is going to absolutely love you. You've definitely picked me to the post on this one.
Oh,
so, yeah.
Okay, but you okay, sorry.
She's going to love that. It's great.
And now it's unedible. You can't cut it out either.
No, I'm not cutting that out.
But to get back to, I think, like, so like, you have people like, say, Megan Follows, like the women who are having these experiments done on them. And again, obviously that's a theme that runs throughout the X-Files, like going back to things like, you know, obviously during the 4th season, things like the Scully cancer arc and all this sort of stuff. I'm not suggesting that the show ever lost sight of it. I'm not suggesting that the show ever stopped paying attention to it. But in the 8th season, you have it thrown into much sharper relief, because with the aliens absent, with the aliens, you know, the colonists at a remove, you have this focus on people who are, like, fundamentally broken and fundamentally scarred, and people who are, like, dealing with the consequences of the stuff that you have seen happening across the show's run. Because alien abductions, they're not new. People being thrown away and disposed, that's not new. Women being victimized and brutalized in the show, as, you know, by people who are more powerful, that's not new either. That's a recurring motif of the show. But when you take away the mythology framework, or the kind of like the seas of bodies, the Pentagon, the men in suits with British accents and stuff like that, it becomes a lot kind of starker. And I think, like, to bring it back to what you said there about Absalom, and one of the things I do find kind of interesting is, obviously, again, this is something that exists in the shadow of Heaven's Gate. They explicitly mention Heaven's Gate in the episode, but it's notable that, like, in the 8th season, you have this recurring preoccupation with, like, failed prophets and failed cult leaders. And again, as you said, the turn of the millennium, this is 2001. So the idea that, like, and again, this is maybe hard to articulate. I don't know, like, again, I don't want to assume about the listenership of this podcast. I don't know what age they are. I don't know how many of them are, like, young millennials or old millennials. I don't know how many of them have memories of, like, 2000. But, like, just to put it in my own...
We're a broad church, Darren. We've got everyone.
We are, much like Chris Chibnall's breakout TV show. We are a broad church. But, like, for me, at least, and I don't want to generalize for people of my age, but, like, you know, the millennium arrived and we were, like, promised that it would be this, like, moment of human consciousness. Everything would change. The clock setting from, you know, again, depending on who you ask, 1999 to 2000 or 2000 to 2001, would, like, symbolize this huge cosmic epochal kind of shift. And then nothing happened. And, like, that's the thing that I really like about the 8th season, is you have, like, with Tippett in Via Negativa, with Absalom here, you have these guys who are like, yeah, no, the end of the world's going to come. It's going to be massive. Aliens are going to invade. It's going to be epic. It's going to be massive. We're going to expand human consciousness. And it's just like, it just never happened. And like, what happens when that just never happens, to kind of sit in your failure and have to ruminate on it. And again, you mentioned the Absalom idea, the idea that he's like, oh no, the world did end in 2000, we just didn't realize, which is like writerly a very clever way of getting out of the fact that you've set a ticking time bomb and you didn't expect the show to be greenlit for an 8th season. It's like, well, you see, the reason why the world didn't end is because it's ending right now. Ooh, gotcha. But it's also a really clever way of, and again, it's something I like in media. It's something that it's something that I think Millennium did very well. Millennium Mystic. You could even say it's Millennium Mystic, to bring back a Jose Chung reference, is that it is that feeling of like the end of the world isn't a light switch. It's not like you go, and again, this is something that I worry is kind of like feels like, you know, maybe an experience that we have all lived through in the past 10 or 5 years or whatever. Yeah. But like the apocalypse isn't a moment where you flick a light and then everything's over and it's like there's a big rap party and champagne and everybody has a good time and it's finally over. It's a sense of it being something that you live through continuously, and it's a slow process that gradually, it's like the frog in the saucepan. And I like that idea here, because it kind, and again, it plays into that theme that we talked about, where this is a very bleak, very dark, very cynical, very grim episode of television, where it's like, actually, the world has been ending at this stage for over a year. You haven't realized that, or maybe you have realized that, because again, for Scully, the world has been ending. Mulder is gone. Everything she thinks she knows has been lost. She's wearing black in this episode in large part because she's still mourning. She's still processing, even if she's not processing on a conscious level. And again, that's the kind of thing that I talk about when I talk about like theme being all tied up in character. But it's like, yeah, for Scully, the world has ended in a very real and substantial way. It just doesn't have to be a literal ending. And again, that's a very second season Millennium thing, where like the second season Millennium is like, what if the apocalypse could be the end of the world for one person, for a family, for a tribe, or for like the entire human race, or for a different group of people? And this is like, no, the world is constantly ending, and the world has been ending. And I think that's a really clever way of getting out of everything that you mentioned there, which is good job, Carter and Spotted.
Yeah, and again, Carter will come back to this when the 2012 year passes and we have a new 2016 TV show. But just moving on from a little bit from the Absalom thing in regards to like things that you mentioned, like Teresa Halsey, because there's a lot of, as you say, the character based focus and on this episode, because you do have, you know, Richie standing in as a Scully kind of thing, the person that's got left behind. You've got Doggett, who's a bit on his own on this one, but has the empathy because he's got his own world-ending moment that happened years ago, which we're not au fait with just yet. And then you've got the likes of Scully has to do the autopsy as well.
Yes. And again, another kind of end of the world. It's an end of a life kind of thing, yeah.
On Gary, who is credited in this episode, even though he's just on the slab, and I was a bit like, oh, that's interesting. But yeah, you have those like kind of reflections for this episode, don't you? With as I say, the character of like Richie being that stand-in, and I think that worked really well. That especially given that we're circling around Scully, given what happened in Requiem, as you say, with the kind of the world ending for Scully at that point, but also the moment. So the way that it builds during the course of this episode, the way that we're introduced to Richie quite early on in the
teaser, when he's driving the car.
Yeah, and he's obviously looking
with the camera, looking for, and he's looking for, like Scully, as he said, he's looking for documentary proof. Like he's really frustrated that he doesn't get the clear shot of it. Yeah. And it's like, well, what do you think you're going to do with that? What will that picture do? What will it materially add? And it's like, it will add vindication or proof for what he wants. Yeah. You know, it'll prove that he's not insane. It will validate him. And again, that's kind of like, is that what Scully's looking for as well? Is she looking to know? You know, is she looking for something she can hold?
And he gets his kick in the sand moment, which I thought was, oh, okay, this is not happening. Shh. We see that he's still looking for Gary. If you know your law well, you know who Gary is.
There will be a test at the end of this episode.
Yeah. Teresa's coming into this as well. So the circle of people who Mulder has been in around the time he was abducted kind of builds to that, but also the reflections on that. I mean, what did you make to those characters actually having that kind of effect on Scully, and the way that gives us the vessel to see Scully's reactions through through their eyes in a lot of ways.
Well, I mean, to be fair, isn't the thing with Teresa that she's holding on to life for her child as well? Like, that's the only thing that seems to keep her going, I think, according to the doctor, if I remember correctly, isn't it?
Maybe, yeah. They didn't catch that, but there's definitely, she's hanging to life by a thread, wasn't she? That and then obviously with Teresa, I'll let you answer the question before I actually finish this. But then Teresa, because she's cured, that's the hope, and then the hope is then dashed. So there's a lot of things that without saying it are making us as an audience feel it, that like, oh, Mulder could be saved. You know, there's stuff like that's permeating right through this episode, using the characters that we've seen in the past.
Well, there's the moment where, like, obviously, like, the fact that, like, it's like, well, we were almost too late. The fact that you know that Jeremiah Smith's there, and the fact that you've seen Jeremiah Smith, obviously, you know, if you're a big mythology fan going back to Talitha Kumi, you know that he can heal. And the fact that, again, as you say, you see him heal even within this episode, it's like, you know, the pieces are all in play. That again, I think, is the ingredient of, like, a great tragedy, is the idea that their pieces are in play, that if things could go just a little bit differently, they could basically, like, you know, if things could go just a little bit differently, all the pieces are there that everybody could have a happy and satisfying resolution. Yeah. And it's just either bad luck, misfortune, bad timing, or poor decision making that results in, like, the chain of dominoes or the Jenga tower kind of collapsing and falling, that ends up with things not ending up the way that they are. So, you know, obviously, you know, Mulder is returned dead, but, you know, obviously Smith is there, and if Smith can get to him, Smith can heal him, but Smith is then also taken, because, again, as we know, the aliens are kind of like cleaning up. They're tidying away all the loose ends from the previous, like, 7 years of mythology. Again, a sense of the show literally tidying up after itself as it goes. And I think, like, what really works about This Is Not Happening is that you have the dissonance. Like, you have that kind of tension in the episode where, like, you know... Again, like Scully, watching this episode, even if you've never seen it before, I think you know on some level that it's not going to end well. It's not going to be a happy episode. The show is not setting you up for a triumphant narrative. Like, the vibe of this thing, the mood of this thing is not, oh, well, Mulder will be back solving X-Files by the end of the hour. Like, everybody in this episode is talking about how they know that they're going to find Mulder dead.
In some field.
In some field somewhere. And then that is exactly what happens. And again, like, even the title of it as well, like, This Is Not Happening. You wouldn't call an episode where Mulder returns to the X-Files and goes back to work This Is Not Happening, because that doesn't fit with it. But, like, what makes it so compelling and so enticing is the fact that, like, even though you know on some level, with any experience of genre, you know, any experience of reading the vibe of a room, any experience of, like, reading the title of an episode, you know it's not going to end well, you can see how, if, like, things just lined up just a little bit differently, if they worked out just a little bit different, if Jeremiah Smith was just a little bit closer, if he wasn't there at that moment in time to be taken away, like, could Mulder have been revived? Would Mulder be saved? And would Scully and Mulder be together at the end of this episode like nothing had ever happened? Would she be sitting at the edge of his bedside holding his hand, and would he be smiling? And would they be back to, you know, the usual next week? And I think, like, the way in which the episode is structured to show you how things could have been different, while also, like, telling you, no, this is exactly how things are, is, I think, what gives the show, like, what gives the episode a great deal of power. Because for all the fact that you know that it has to end the way that it ends, the fact that there's the potential that it could work itself out is kind of compelling. Again, I think of, like, The Empire Strikes Back, where, like, you look at that and it's like, that episode, that, you know, that is, again, that's one of the great, you know, movies. It's like one of the great second acts of a trilogy. It's one of the shows, one of the movies that I think, like, you know, taught an entire generation how tragedy works. And again, I don't know if they were explicitly modeling this on the end of The Empire Strikes Back, but we do know that, like, the show has drawn from Star Wars at various points in its own history, down to literally having an alien bounty hunter in it, for example, or the opening shot of Jose Chung's From Outer Space mirroring Star Wars, and the fact that, you know, so much of this comes from New Hollywood. But it does really feel like you're shown how our heroes, if things had just gone a little bit differently, if things had broken just a little bit in their favor, they could all have a happy ending. But that's not what this story is, and I kind of, like, I love that aspect of it.
For me as well, the way that we've got Reyes coming into the episode as well. Personally, for me, I've listened, I've obviously read things from Spotnitz and Carter saying that they needed the balance and they needed that. But what I find really fascinating with this episode is that in some ways she is central to the understanding of what happens in this is not happening, because she arrives and there's miscommunication between both her and Scully, and they are constantly not really, and it's the same with Doggett as well in that scene at the just at the cliff edge where we get introduced to Reyes. And we will talk about Reyes because I think it's an introduction to a quite an important character. Just on purely, not necessarily on Reyes as a character just at the moment, but just the way that it's brought in. I feel that the miscommunications, the things like saying, well, you don't believe in the UFO phenomenon. Well, I didn't not say that. I said that I don't believe this one is, but I'm not saying I don't believe in UFOs. And the miscommunication kind of leads directly into the fact that, everyone's trying to save the people that have been left, and no one's succeeding because everyone's getting in everyone's way. Yeah,
I mean, you have that moment where, like, Jeremiah Smith says, you came crashing in here, I was trying to help him.
Yeah.
Like, the idea of, like, working at counter purposes, and the idea, again, that very X-Files tragedy sense of, like, nobody understands anything, the universe is fundamentally unknowable, and our inability to communicate clearly to one another is, going to cause the end of the world,
Yeah, so I find that really fascinating with Reyes' character and the way it's introduced and the way that, again, it's really difficult, and we can talk. I can give you your opinion on the way that Reyes is introduced here and what you think of her as a character. But the just the way that she is introduced in this, and that we've got the smoking, which we will talk about in the mailbag because that has been talked about in there. Or we've got the miscommunication, the way that she's portrayed in this as well. In that she has the spiritual, the religious cult aspect to her that is kind of quite millenniumistic in a way. That she even talks about some of the senses that she might have. So it has that mode of a bit of millennium in there as well. But on top of that, she's got this spiritual element to her. And I really did like the way that the miscommunication worked throughout Scully. And the way Scully bounces off Reyes, especially when they're looking for the implant section, I thought was really good. But what do you think to the introduction of Reyes at this moment in time?
I mean, again, like, it's notable that this is the first episode that has all 5 of the credited leads in the truth in it. This is the point at which you get all 5 of the cast who are going to carry the show into its final season and into its final episode as well. Even if arguably at least 2, if not 3 of those 5 members are not particularly well served by the truth, and perhaps not well served by what follows after the truth either. But I think like Reyes is like, I like Reyes. I like Annabeth Gish as an actor. I think there's a lot of potential there. I think the only episode where Reyes really clicks for me is Improbable in the 9th season. I think that's probably the best Reyes episode by a significant margin. And I think Reyes suffers because she's... And again, Spotnitz has talked about this. When they were writing the season, they were aware of the fact that they needed balance on the show. And they needed another member of the ensemble. And it couldn't be Doggett, Mulder, and Scully, which is odd because I actually quite like that dynamic, and I like that dynamic even when you get into the final 8 episodes. Like, I like that Doggett has a dynamic with Scully that is different from his dynamic with Mulder, and that Mulder has obviously a very different dynamic with Scully than he does with Doggett. And like, you can get episodes that push the 3 of them in various combinations in ways that are interesting. I don't necessarily agree with Doggett that having 3 people is inherently imbalanced. A tripod is a very stable shape. Thank you very much there. But he did say that, like, they needed a 4th person, and he specifically put it in terms of for the believer skeptic dynamic to work. We didn't want 2 skeptics and 1 believer. And it's like, you know what? This is the X-Files. The audience knows Mulder's right. He can maybe handle 2 skeptics. I feel like Mulder doesn't need backup. He gets to be right 100% of the time. He doesn't need like a second person to back him up. But I think that Reyes does suffer because they wait to introduce her until the point where they reintroduce Mulder. And like, I see why that is from a mathematical point of view, that like 2 equals 2, like on the two sides of the equation. But it also means that, like, Reyes, you have to wait until you're 2/3 of the way through the season, roughly, to introduce Reyes. And you have to wait until you've not only introduced Reyes, but you've reintroduced a character that the audience has been waiting for like 14 episodes. The audience is hyped for Mulder to come back. They want more Mulder. They want Mulder in every episode, in every second of every episode, with every interaction that's possible within those. They want to watch Mulder interact with Scully, they want to watch him interact with Skinner, they want to watch him interact with Doggett, and it's like, but Reyes is here too, and it's like, how do you think you're going to make the audience care about Reyes? And how do you think you're going to have time to focus on Reyes' development as a character in this stretch of, like, 7 or 8 episodes down the back end, where you also have to wrap up Mulder's arc? Wouldn't it have made more sense to introduce Reyes earlier in the season? Maybe not at the start to give Doggett some breathing room, but maybe introduce her around, say, when you're producing Per Manum or when you're releasing Via Negativa, and give her a little bit of breathing room where she's not immediately, like, overshadowed by the return of a beloved character. And I think Reyes also kind of suffers a little bit. And again, part of this is probably just down to the simple fact that she's introduced while all this other stuff is happening, so she doesn't get a chance to be defined. Like, with Mulder, you have the inherent paradox of Mulder wants to believe, but he has to believe because that's rooted in emotion. And, like, within 4 episodes of his introduction, you have, like, I think Samantha's mentioned in the pilot, but, like, she's a major focal point in Conduit, which is 4 episodes after the pilot. Yeah. Scully, is a skeptic, and she's introduced as a skeptic, and, like, but she's religious, and that religious belief comes up quite a bit. Things like her relationship with her father, for example, again, even in her first season, and you have that kind of compelling paradox between the two, and push and pull between them. And then you have Doggett, and you're right, like, even here we haven't necessarily gone beat per beat through what exactly happened to Doggett, but you have had episodes like Invocation, which make it very clear thematically and kind of, like, emotionally what has happened to Doggett, and, like, why he feels the way that he does, in that his resistance to belief is rooted in emotion as a reversal of Mulder's insistence on belief. Mulder needs to believe because that makes sense of his trauma. Doggett needs to not believe because that makes sense of his trauma. And if he were to believe, he would be confronted with his own emotional inadequacy. Whereas Reyes doesn't get any of that complexity or nuance or depth or shading. And certainly not in this stretch of the season, and I don't really think that she gets much in the 9th season either. Reyes just believes everything uncritically. Like, she exists largely to make Mulder seem like he's discerning, and, like, that is a problem. And I like Reyes and I like Gish, and I think that, like, when the show gets on Reyes's wavelength, which I don't think it does as often as it needs to, but when it does, in, say, Improbable, which is an episode... Improbable is an episode that only works with Reyes. You need somebody who will just go with the idea that Burt Reynolds is God and numbers are the key to the universe without any critical thinking whatsoever for that episode to work. I don't think Mulder could carry that episode in the way that Reyes does. But I do think that she suffers here because there's so much happening around her that she doesn't really get any definition as a character beyond, well, she believes anything and everything, and, that's her function here. I do think she works quite well in terms of, and again, you mentioned the religious element of it, and obviously you mentioned, like, tying back to Millennium, and I think that stuff works rather well. I think she works well enough here as well. Like, I think Scully says at one point, this is like going to therapy. But, like, she serves as a mouthpiece for, like, the none too subtle subtext of this is not happening. In particular, it is, like, she gets the line that explains the title of this episode. Obviously, like, this is not happening is the mantra. It's repeated at the start of the episode, and you get the, oh no, this is not happening, to the, this is not happening, kind of like the full range of emotion that you could deliver on that phrase. But you have her explaining, like, that what happened being different from what we want to have happened. And so this is not happening is a rejection of that. It's an attempt to assert what we want to be true over what we know to be true, and how that, and again, that's arguably fundamentally one of the core tensions of the X-Files as a TV show. I want to believe. So this is not happening is a phrase that exists in conversation with that, and Reyes gets to voice that, which I think is good. But yeah, I find myself conflicted on her as a character and her efficacy. I also not to jump too far into the future, I do think the revival does her dirty.
Maybe a little bit, but that's for a few years' time. In regards to this episode, like I was saying with the confusion element, and me and you should talk sometime. You need someone outside of the scope of the Doggett, the Skinner, and the Scully, because they're so far into it that she's brought in to Doggett's character in a lot of ways, but actually brought in just to be that cold, hard look at the evidence and the facts and things that, as you say, will actually say those words and make us reflect on that. So, from regards to this episode being her introduction, I thought worked well. The actual direction of it by Manners is fantastic.
Yes, when she's on the hill and you see her in the distance, and like she's just this figure kind of standing on the horizon. Again, like looks beautiful. This is an episode that relies so heavily on mood. If it doesn't look gorgeous, it's going. Like I was watching this today, and it wasn't like there's plenty of television today that doesn't look this cinematic. This is where I'm turning into my old man shaking his fist at the sky. But things like the use of... I think this got an Emmy nomination for cinematography for a single camera series, if I remember correctly, as well.
All right.
But it looks absolutely gorgeous throughout. And you're right, that scene of her up on the hill where she's standing with the coat against the blue sky, but it's kind of like the shrubbery is kind of dying on the hill, so it's got that kind of morbid kind of thing that you have running through the episode, and it just communicates so much effectively. And without getting too into the she's introduced smoking a cigarette aspect of it all, the fact that she is introduced smoking a cigarette, and cigarettes are, in many cases linked with, in this show they're linked with corruption, but in real life they tend to be linked with things like death and disease and infection. Again, you have this idea of morbidity kind of running through the episode, and I think it's all very effective, and it's all communicated so well in a character who is new and dropping in, and the audience is wondering why are we spending time with this person? I want Mulder, damn it, you promised me David Duchovny.
As I say, it's almost like more of to do with Doggett, and we've seen of Doggett a lot of times where he's using his usual beat cop idea that let's bring in somebody that we might know, that I know that can maybe help with this case. He also talks at the beginning with Richie and had some interesting dialogue with him, with the 9.5 Nikes.
And some nice product placement for Nikes. Yes, and I love that the camera lingers on the Nikes later on as well, the Nike. So it's a good product placement.
The way that the actor, because obviously I can't imagine it being, what's his name?
Roy Thames?
Roy Thames, yeah. Kind of turns around. If it's him, I think it's probably a double, to be fair. The way he turns around and he kind of takes a slow step. And it's X-Files, this is not happening. Sponsored by Nike.
Yeah. Well, it is sweeps, You want your shoes in sweeps week, baby. You want your shoes in sweeps week.
Yeah. No one turns around like that.
I don't know. He was wearing sneakers for sneaking.
Well, that's true. That's very true. One of the moments I would say, basically, I'm coming to the point of, what do you think of Doggett in this episode? But
what do you think of Doggett?
What do you think of Doggett in this episode?
Oh, it was nominated for a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Cinematography, so yes, I was right about that. Okay.
Yeah. The way that, I just love the way that Richie just turned around and said, yeah, but what about the spaceship? It's
I also love the "can we come in? You're already in," which is great.
Yeah. So why would an alien wear sneakers? Well, what about the spaceship? I think it's a brilliant line. But yeah, and the moment, and this is going to be a bit ironic in that one of my favourite moments of this episode, and will always call back to, is the look of Doggett's face when he's walking towards Scully, when Scully's actually going to Mulder. There's something about the way that that's filmed in the typical Kim Manners style that you can tell what Robert Patrick is trying to portray with I don't want you anywhere near this kind of thing, and just I'm trying to protect you, and then obviously everything that happened on there. But as I say, Doggett is true to character. He's true to his cop ideals. He's true to the questioning. There's absolutely no mistake in the fact that police officers come in with evidence that they give to Doggett. It's all in relation to him. And then, as I say, that we've touched upon a little bit before about his kid that we don't really know too much about apart from Invocation.
And by the way, that's again another thing that I think works really well in the 8th season, and it's worth kind of singling out in terms of, we talked about it being one long story. And again, this is a point where DVDs are becoming available, so you can you can now sell like entire seasons like in packages. I think was it 24 was going to launch the following September, and that was a show that really like defined the idea that you could watch TV on DVD in a way that you couldn't really do on VHS, because obviously packing 20 odd hours of something into a VHS is impossible, but you can do it on a disc release. But season 8 works really, really well on rewatch. And again, all of the X-Files does, to the show's credit, to be absolutely clear, but season 8 in particular does, because once you know everything about what happened to Doggett, once you know all the details of what happened with Doggett, his character throughout the season remains remarkably consistent. So that idea of him searching for Mulder, and the way in which, like, Scully is obviously searching for Mulder because, you know, she loves him. And, you know, spoiler alert, he may or may not be the baby daddy. He may or may not be the partner that she wants to raise the child with, even if he is or is not the baby daddy.
Let's not get into that.
Yeah, I know. It's all, and to be honest, listeners have another 5 years of that conversation to look forward to. But like you have this idea of like, you know why finding Mulder is important for Scully, but when you go back and you rewatch it, you start to get why finding Mulder is important for Doggett.
Yeah.
And why he does the things that he does. And in particular, and again, this is something I think the show does. I think I talked about this on Without, so I won't labor it too much, but one of the things I really like about the show with Doggett is that it doesn't make him antagonistic. It doesn't make him an asshole. It doesn't present him as a roadblock. It doesn't present him as somebody who is hostile. Like, he is more supportive of Scully than Scully is of Mulder, in that, like, he tries constantly throughout the season to understand how Scully sees the world. He just can't. He can't do it mentally. Like, and I love that the show is like is it Roadrunners or is it Patient? I think it's Roadrunners, where he's reading all the X-Files, or it's like Patience reveals that he did it over a long weekend. He came in and he read every single X-Files case file that there was. And there are points throughout the season where he's like, oh, maybe this is like that episode. And it's like, Doggett like has clearly been doing the work, and he's trying. And as you say, like, bringing in Reyes, and like, there's that tension when he brings in Reyes, and I find it really interesting, where like Reyes, and again, you'll find like all this stuff is stuff that kind of becomes more explicit when you find out more about Doggett's backstory, and you find out in particular more about obviously the case that he worked with Reyes, which is alluded to here. But like, from when you discover the particulars of that case, you discover that Reyes was telling Doggett things that he didn't want to hear, and things that he didn't believe, and things that he to this day cannot believe, because if he does believe them, he shatters his own sense of the world, and he believes that he can no longer believe that he did everything that he could to solve that case. Is probably the way of talking about this as vaguely as one can, right? But, and this is again something I find really interesting and really compelling. He, despite knowing that, despite like disagreeing with Reyes over the most important case that he has ever worked, he brings her into this case to talk to Scully. And when he does that, and again, wonderful stuff in performance from Robert Patrick, who is just phenomenal here. Wonderful stuff in writing from Carter and Spotnitz, where you have the tension between what characters say they're doing and what they're actually doing, which is, again, I think one of the cornerstones of great character work and great drama, where he brings Reyes in, and according to him, he's bringing Reyes in because he thinks that this might be a ritualistic religious case, and she's an expert in ritualistic and religious crime. And in fact, like, when they're having the conversation up on top of the mountain, you know, Doggett's like, oh, this is what's happening. And then Reyes literally has to stop him and say, that's not what I was saying at all. Like, I'm not just saying what you claim you brought me here to say, but you also know that Doggett knows Reyes. And that even if he's rationalized this to himself in terms of saying, well, she's an expert in the field of ritual violence, and this looks like it could be a ritualized violence case, you also know that he knows that she is capable of making the leaps that he cannot make, that she can believe in the things that he will not believe, that he can connect with, again, everything in the X-Files, with everything that Mulder believes, with everything that Scully has tried to believe. And again, obviously Badla is not a fantastic episode of television, but it does have that wonderful tension where Scully is like trying to be Mulder and trying to make sense and trying to figure out, but can't. Doggett understands that Reyes can do that Reyes has that capacity for belief within her, and he brings her in even though he himself doesn't believe. And that's a wonderful character beat there for everybody involved. It's a wonderful thing that says a lot about who Doggett is and what Doggett believes and what Doggett tells himself, and how that runs counter to maybe what he actually knows deep inside himself, and the tension between those things. And I think that's just really great writing. And again, in an episode where, Doggett is arguably not the focus here. This is arguably like about Scully and about Mulder, but you still get that wonderful character beat for Doggett, which is like he is trying to find Mulder to atone for that one case he worked that he feels guilty and ashamed about. And he didn't do this stuff back then, and he can't allow himself to think that it would have been different if he did. But he also understands that maybe he can nudge Scully towards that. And I think that's incredible character work, to be frank. And I think that's brilliant. I think that's what I love about this season.
During one of the best scenes of this episode is when Gary is about to have that autopsy. You've got Skinner, Doggett and Scully all in frame. Doggett's at the back of the frame, and you can feel just the emotion that's emanating off him, because he's feeling empathy for Scully. And then, as we've already talked about, then the next scene is about him sitting outside in the chair, and then Reyes will come in and talk to him about his actual situation. That whole scene is such a emotional moment for Scully, but you can trace it back, and you can still find things like that with Doggett, and it's such an amazing, as you say, the emotional aspect of this episode really pushes that, and it really just has those layers to it. And I just find it really fascinating that this episode can do that, and it actually has that raw, visceral, emotional, heart-wrenching stuff permeating right through the most, if not all, of the characters. And Scully's, we've got Skinner obviously feeling that empathy and is the shoulder to cry on, which we will see, with the Starlight discussion, which again, it's great looking at the James Webb pictures that have just come out today. That Starlight is a callback to Closure, and again linking that mythology, but linking it in a way that's not been done before. It's not linking it as if like, okay, we've got the Black Hole, this is going to do this now. This is just the case of we once had a conversation about Starlight, and as you mentioned, it's preparing us for the finale of the episode. Yeah, I mean, like, it's an emotion. Again, it's like kind of like the idea that it's not driven as much by plot or theme as by character, where it's like that scene where Mulder and Scully talk about Star. And again, like, worth noting, this is the show thinking that it's going to end. Like, Scully and Mulder, or Scully and Skinner, they're talking about the idea of light transmitting through space, and the idea that what you see from stars was generated like hundreds or thousands or millions of years ago. But it's the idea that, like, the X-Files is going to be like that at some moment in time. Like, when the writers are writing this, when Kim Manners is filming this, when the actors are performing this is back in, 2000, 2001, depending on when they shot it. And it's like, you will be watching that into the future. Like, so light will continue to shine like the light from those stars. You and I will still be watching and talking about that moment or that conversation in 2022. People will still probably be talking about it in 2050, 2100, that sort of stuff. And the idea that, like, and again, it's the idea the show is kind of confronting its own mortality. Like, Closure and Sign on Zeta are about, like, the idea, it's the 7th season, we need to wrap up the Samantha storyline, we need to be ready to have closure, to end the X-Files. Whereas the 8th season is like, no, we are actually aware of that. We know that with certainty that we can bookend that conversation, and we can say, yeah, we have to finish this. Because, and again, not to put too fine a point on it, but, like, after this, Mulder's character arc is pretty much done.
Like, Mulder's big chase throughout the X-Files has been the idea of, like, wanting to believe and wanting to know. And there's always been this tension about what that actually means, because it's like when Mulder finds out about the conspirators, like, when he documents all of their crimes, like, when the conspiracy is burnt to the ground in the 6th season, in Two Fathers, One Son, like, what does Mulder actually accomplish? Does he, like, I don't know, publish a book? Does he testify in the Senate? Does he take it to the FBI? What does he do once he knows all this stuff? And the answer is that, like, it wasn't actually about necessarily proving it to anybody else. Like, that's the difference between Mulder and Scully. Scully's obsessed with, like, proof and documenting. Mulder just wants to know. And Mulder's journey in this 8th season, where he's abducted by aliens and he's taken away, that is a very fundamental sort of knowing. Mulder has known all that there is to know about what happened to Samantha because he has literally lived that experience. He's lived the experience of being abducted and experimented upon. He knows in a truly intimate, truly personal kind of way, in a way that kind of reminds me of, is it The Vanishing? Is that the Danish movie, or the one that was remade with Kiefer Sutherland, where you have that idea of, like, I want to know what happened to this person who just disappeared, and the end of the movie is, well, yes, the character does find out what happened to the person who disappeared, but the idea is that you can never know that without experiencing it yourself. Yeah. So the idea that Mulder's journey is in some ways complete here, even beyond the fact that he's dead at the end of it, but, like, he has done everything that he could have wanted to do at the start of the X-Files. Now, slight spoiler alert for the end of the 8th season, Mulder still has a journey to go on. It is a journey of fatherhood, but we'll get there in time.
Not without a shower first.
Not without a shower first. I mean, I do love, like, again, maybe I'll be talking about this, so maybe I'll be talking about, like, Nothing Important Happened Today, but I do love that David Duchovny's stunt ass appears before any of the credited leads in Nothing Important Happened Today.
Yep. That is better if ever solved. So yeah, I mean, let's talk about the main focus, and let's talk about Gillian Anderson and the portrayal in this. I'm not going to ask any more questions. Just what do you think?
Gillian Anderson. She's fantastic. Like, it's an amazing season of television, and Anderson does a phenomenal amount of work here, and, like, she carries this season again remarkably well. Now, to the show's credit, the writers do work hard to build an ensemble around her, and you could argue that for the first time, The X-Files is truly an ensemble show. I mean, in the past, obviously, you had episodes focusing on guest stars, episodes like, say, S or is it 619? I always get the number wrong.
819.
819. Damn it. It's because of the 6th season episode. It goes in my head. I think it should be. But it's like, yeah, so you have episodes like that, episodes like Avatar, for example, Music of the Cigarette Smoking Man. We've had episodes that do focus on people who are not Mulder and Scully and give Duchovny and Anderson, like, time off. But, like, the 8th season, the writers do go out of their way to do things like, say, Via Negativa, which, like, gives Anderson time to visit her daughter up in Canada, for example, in Vancouver. And even here, as we mentioned, the idea that, like, all of these arcs are threaded through the episode, not just Scully's, but at the same time, it's Anderson who is carrying this. It's Anderson who is the emotional core of this episode. It's beating heart. If we don't believe in what Scully is experiencing, if we don't go on that emotional journey with her, then the episode simply doesn't work, and it's astounding. Like, it's a staggering performance. I mean, again, we talked on the podcast before, I like Duchovny. I think Duchovny's performance is underrated. I think that, like, a lot of people take cheap shots at Duchovny's like, performance choices. I do think it is more mannered and more stylized than Anderson's. But I do think Anderson is the strongest of the two leads. I think she's a phenomenal performer. I think she's one of the best actors working in television to have worked in television, at least within my lifetime. And I think that this is a showcase for her. I think the 8th season as a whole is a showcase where even episodes that don't necessarily work particularly well on their own merits, bad lass, sorry, but they coast by because Anderson is just so compelling to watch here. And it's frustrating because, you know, not to get too spoilery about, like, what will happen in the 9th season, but you end up with Scully being kind of, you end up with Scully being reduced to a stereotype of my baby, my baby, my baby, whereas here she's a much more layered, much more complex, much more nuanced character, where you have that like, again, like with Doggett, and again, like with any great drama, and anything that, like, actors, and you talk to actors, anything that dramatic actors love playing, is that idea of a tension between something the character, like, actually believes versus what they want to believe. where, like, again, we've talked about it repeatedly on this, but it is the nub of the episode. It's the fact that, like, Scully wants to find Mulder, but also doesn't want to find Mulder. Scully wants to believe that Mulder will be okay, that she can find him and everything will go back to normal, but she also knows in her soul that it's very, very, very unlikely that it will actually work out that way. And the idea that she is like, again, for all that this is more of an ensemble than it ever was before, by taking Mulder away, by dislocating like literally one half of the credited leads of the X-Files over its first 7 seasons, you have created a show where Scully is more isolated and more alone than she ever has been before. And I think like it's hard to overstate how phenomenal Anderson is in this season, in large part because Scully is a character who is like very introverted by her nature. She's a character who is very like she doesn't really have like Duchovny like can do shouting, acting, yelling at 11 and does it very frequently. And obviously Anderson gets those moments as well over the course of the show's run. But a lot of the key Scully moments are like quiet, still moments where she's just reacting to stuff. And like, again, so much of the X-Files is built around the idea of Mulder being the dynamic character who always gets to be right, and Scully being the character who has to some extent be the kind of the negative Nelly, to be the character who's like no fun, and it's like there must be a rational explanation for this, and Mulder's like, I don't know, we saw a disembodied head floating in space cursing monsters or whatever, a giant face of Mars attacked me in a car, and Scully's like, it could have been the rain, I don't know. Kaddish is like one of the great ones where she's like, I don't know, maybe it was like compressed and there was oil and it was exposed to air and maybe that's what caused it to light on fire. And, you know, that kind of like Scully having to be the character who basically reacts to Mulder. So when you take Mulder away, the fact that Scully has to both drive the action but also remain Scully, remain this very introspective, very thoughtful, very considered character who's largely defined in conversation with a partner who is not present for most of the season. Anderson's work is just astounding. It is amazing. Like large part of why I love this season.
Yeah, I mean, I think the actual moments that which she plays a lot of reactionary moments in this episode, because you've got Doggett, as you've mentioned, Doggett says something along the lines of, you know, you want to find him, but you also don't want to.
You're afraid to. Yeah.
And the fear, like you said, the fear thing. When Absalom is talking to her and she shows him the photograph, and you know, you can feel that fear. You can feel that fear from her. That, have you seen this man? And he says no, and you can feel that visceral reaction. The reaction to Jeremiah Smith when he changes form after Reyes leaves the room. And we don't see normally in any other show, which is a real credit to Commanders on this. And any other episode, you would see the shift into Jeremiah, but this is purely focused on Gillian Anderson's face, and it's the reaction. You know from that reaction that it is Jeremiah Smith. You know, because it's just the reaction of Gillian Anderson's face, which
is a lot to trust an actor to deliver. Like, yeah. You're not trusting her to deliver a lot. You're not trusting her to deliver an emotion. You're trusting her to deliver. Oh, by the way, this guest star has returned.
Yeah,
and not the star who you're waiting to return at the end of this episode. Like,
yeah, definitely. And then, as I said, the scene at the tree site, and then this is not happening in line. So, other things that I've mentioned throughout this episode as well, you know, that the moment where she's in the room with Richie Slay and she says a couple of things, he says a couple of things, which has a reaction from Scully. The very beginning, you know, when Doggett is actually another great. Robert Patrick's face, and sometimes it's just a picture. It's lovely to see, and it is frustrating. I was thinking this when I was watching this episode today, that I think X-Files might have influenced me too much on sometimes, because I often do what Doggett does to Scully at the beginning of this episode, where I'll say something and went, no, you need to speak to Darren. So we're going to go and speak to Darren. I'm not going to tell you anything about this. We're going to go force flights upstairs. We're then going to go into...
This is Kurt's managerial style.
We're then going to go into Skinner's office, and then Skinner's going to tell you, but then we're not going to tell you quite the way we're going to tell you, right? But then you would say, what are you implying?
How awkward do you think that elevator ride was?
Quite.
Like when they were just going to Skinner's office. Like, do you think they made small talk?
I don't know. It's like just side eye. Scully just side eye him, Doggett. So that I think is instilled in me. But the look that Doggett says, and I think Doggett says a line which was quite pertinent as well, and Gillian's again portrayal is like, why do I need to care about this? Are you alluding to the fact this is Mulder? Everything that she does throughout this episode is faultless. Absolutely faultless.
No, it's superb. It's a masterclass. And again, like, I know Anderson got her Emmy for the work on the 4th season, but she really, really, really deserved more for her work on this show. But I mean, and to be fair, in general, Anderson's one of those actors who I'm always glad to see pop up and stuff. And particularly on television, she works very, very well in kind of long form, where she has a chance to really dig into characters and kind of like, again, give them kind of these rich inner lives, which you don't always get. But I think she's superb. She's amazing.
Absolutely. And finally, David Duchovny's back. What did you think to his performance?
All of history's great acting robots, including David Duchovny. Sorry, that was me.
And was that even him in the field? Because it's likely is his mask that they've used.
Yeah, well, isn't that the line? Like, I think that there's a line from one of the production materials where they say that actually, because Duchovny wasn't available, it was an extra kind of wearing a Duchovny mask. Which, if that is the case, in high definition, that is stunning. Oh, that's makeup artist Sherry Medcalf talking to the Complete X-Files, says that's a photo double with a mask of David Duchovny. It's a brilliant job because no one knew that, and like, it still holds up in like HD, which is very impressive. To be fair.
So was it? I thought that was maybe the funeral scene, but it might be both linked together potentially. So
that's fair. That probably makes sense as well. I do love the idea that they dragged him out and dropped him in a field, and it's like, yeah, but don't worry, we got somebody doing the coffin scene, so it's fine.
So he was on the ship, and I think also something I wanted to mention actually with David Duchovny, because I mentioned this in the previous episode in The Gift, because John Doggett sees Mulder in the office when he goes through The Gift, and it's almost like and I know that myself and Ellie talked about this, about whether or not it's their perception. Could it just be for the audience? And a lot of you can take it a lot of ways, and I like that about TV shows, that you can do that. But Mulder appears twice in this form, and I took it, I think, when I was younger, and as I've seen the episode since it's opened up my questioning. But I took it as Doggett seeing Mulder was close to death, and you get it again here that he is close to death with the ghostly image of Mulder. So that happens twice in 4 or 5 episodes. Scully seeing him in the blue light, which is obviously referring to the starlight element to it. And
also, I mean, obviously echoing things like going back to her father, even if Beyond the Sea, for example. Like, I mean, again, this is how the X-Files traditionally portrays this stuff, so it's part of the language of the show. Yeah. So I certainly wouldn't dispute that reading as well. And it, again, does tie back into the idea that this is a season about death. If I remember correctly, like, and again, I haven't watched this season as recently as you guys have, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but do I remember is like the opening scene of Patience is a mortician, right? It's a mortician in Patience who's attacked at the very start by Vampire Boy. Yeah. Just to reinforce the parallels here and the sense of morbidity and death that run through the season. I love nice thematic consistency.
And Scully, I know this is a reimagining of it, and whether or not this was intended or not, but the revival stuff with Scully and having the linkage that we get at the beginning of this season with and without, and we also see Mulder in various different guises within the UFO, whether or not that is a link of some sort, or is it a portrayal for the show to show the body horror aspects, or is she just dreaming that, or is she actually having some congenital link with him?
Well, I mean, like, to be fair, that like Dr. Desai does kind of do that. He does explain that like the torture was consistent with Scully's vision, where it was the linear pattern of the tears on the cheeks, the drills at the back of the hard pellet and stuff like that. That would seem to suggest that like at least what we saw is real. But the fact that Scully is seeing it as well does suggest that there is, and again, it's that existential spiritual thing where it's like there is a religious component there. There is no science fiction explanation for how Scully could know that, how Scully could have that level of precise knowledge of what was happening. That's not how any of the implants in the show have ever been shown to work or anything like that. So it is instead, again, like the X-Files. And then, the X-Files is, again, I want to believe. It's not exactly subtle. It's a show in many ways about faith and belief and spirituality as much as it is about aliens. But the idea that, she does have that connection. And I don't think that we're meant to like take her at her word that, I had a nightmare. I think we are meant to take it that there is a link there, that like she does feel something across all that time and across all that space, that there is something that ties the two of them together. And again, I like that the show doesn't labor it too much. Yeah. And again, part of this is kind of arguably just Carter being Carter, where like Carter is incapable of writing a romantic couple who are like perfectly happy together. But he can write really great stories about like longing and desire and separation. Like Harsh Realm is not a good TV show, but it's built around this idea of two characters who are separated from one another and long to be reunited with one another. And again, you can arguably see that filtering through into how he writes the Mulder and Scully relationship here, where you have one character who is literally separated from another by being trapped in what appears to be another world, perhaps even another reality or another dimension. But they still feel some sort of connection to one another in spite of, all the logic or science that should say that they shouldn't. I think we are meant to, given the specificity of that imagery, I think we are meant to take it that, that is real, that connection is not just Scully's conjuring of her vision. Because again, Scully was abducted, but Scully's abduction has always been presented differently. Scully's abduction has never been presented like that. It's not as if she's repurposing what happened to her as what's happening to Mulder. What's happening to Mulder is much more graphic. And as we discussed on Without, is also arguably much more analogous to what is happening to Scully herself, with the penetration of his body and the drilling of his body and the idea of something growing within his body, perhaps creating, like, again, a thematic connection to what is, like, literally biologically happening with Scully.
And if you want to see how Chris Carter does write a married couple, then by all means come over to The Time Is Now, a Millennium podcast, in which we talk about him and sex scenes and all kinds.
Well, isn't it Emily St. James made the observation that, like, Chris Carter, like, we're even in a Chris Carter show, a married couple can't have sex without one of them being abducted immediately afterwards.
Spoiler alert for Millennium. Anyway, two more things from me before we go into the mailbag. I think talking about, to be fair to obviously the set design, I think it was especially Within Without and this episode with the alien ship, has that kind of look, and some of the stuff in the background in HD works really well. It was taken
from Alien as well, I believe. Like, I think it was like from the old Fox lot. I believe they recycled some material from Alien. Oh, and again, not to tie that too much into like the themes of like pregnancy and body horror, but it's there.
It is there. And it does link into the Fight the Future kind of stylistic approach as well.
Yeah.
And the score, because I don't think it would be amiss of me not to mention the score, because I think this is probably one of the best scores in the entire run for me. I think it's wonderfully, masterfully done. It could have quite easily gone into the absurd or cheesy, especially with some of the stints they use, but it just doesn't seem to do that, and I think it's a wonderful moment for Mark Snow.
Yeah, and again, like, I think his work throughout the 8th season is similarly kind of amazing and compelling, and again, it's a season that kind of works because it has these meditative spaces where it's not afraid to give you these, like, again, these wide shots, these moments of silence, of consideration, these, like, moments of looking at actors' faces reacting to things, and the willingness to let, like, the music kind of seep into that and kind of enrich that. And again, as we said, like, convey some of the emotion, like, underneath that. And again, we talked about how great the actors are at conveying emotion. They absolutely are. But Snow really, really, really orchestrates that. Like, again, it's really storytelling that I think is incredibly confident and trusting in itself, which I really admire. I can't think of, this is arguably closer to something like, say, The Leftovers, than it is to I don't know, a lot of modern genre television, which I can't help but be amazed at, like, a show that aired on Fox in February 2001. Like, it's reminding me of, like, The Leftovers.
Yeah, what an amazing show that is. I recently managed to get to finally watch that over the last couple of years, and It's an amazing show. I would definitely recommend Leftovers. I think for me with the music as well, is it's one of those rare episodes where I'm feeling the pad. As soon as the image is on screen, I'm imagining myself hitting a keyboard and hitting those chords. I'm not a keyboard player. I know a couple of chords here and there, but it's like I know when those are coming in, and it's not very often. The scores can either do one of two things. It can either like float in the background and give you that emotional feel. It can be really cheesy, or it can do that and actually add to the substance of the actual scene. And I think this episode does that. It's not hiding in the background. It's forefront. And yes, we've got the where is now kind of thing with Scully's theme. But as I said,
we are near.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah,
which is beautiful. Like, and again, like not subtle. The show is never subtle, but it conveys that sense of that sense of Scully not being able to articulate. Because again, that's the thing that I love about this season so much, is that like all of this is happening subtextually. Like, so this stuff where Scully is on some level, and again, I need to be very careful how I word this. Scully is very capable of raising that child by herself if she needs to. She's very capable of raising William by herself. She will be an amazing mother, but she wants Mulder, or she wants Mulder to be there, and she wants, like, spoiler alert, like, even after Mulder returns in this episode, the key arc for the rest of the season is if Mulder is going to be a father, if Mulder is going to be present emotionally more than just physically. So you have this kind of wonderful arc where, like, Mulder's physical absence from the first 2/3 of the season, which again, dictated by contractual obligations with David Duchovny, but ends up like setting up this idea of Mulder's emotional presence as the arc that drives the kind of final stretch of the season. But the idea is Scully never says any of this. Scully never says any of this out loud. She never says, and in fact she says like the opposite. Like, she says very much to Mulder, like the way in which she interacts with Mulder in, say, 3 words, for example, or kind of later in the season, she's not going to force this on Mulder. And again, whatever revelations about the nature of the pregnancy that may or may not come in the revival, there is a sense watching the 8th season that as far as Scully is concerned, Mulder is the father biologically of this child, but she is not going to force that on him, and she's not going to force that on him socially. She's not going to acknowledge that because she doesn't want him to feel a sense of obligation. She wants him to be the father to this child, not because of biological circumstance, not because of genetics, but because he wants to be. Because he wants to be part of the family with her, because he wants to be with her and their child, or the child that may or may not be theirs, depending on when you're watching the show and which retcons you consider to take priority. But Scully never says any of this.
No.
The season never lays any of this out. It's all articulated again through Anderson's performance, through the use of theme and plot to suggest this character arc, and through, again, Mark Snow's score, where you have, and again, the use of music, you know, and again, in musicals most literally, but in you know, film and television in general, to articulate things that cannot or will not be said by the characters on screen. So that call of we are near ends up like speaking to something within Scully that she could never say, that she could never quite articulate, that she could never get out of her. Yeah. And again, that's just like perfect use of music in a show.
Yeah, and as I say, it's definitely memorable for that reason. So we've come to the end of our general discussion. Is there anything that you want to add to what we've already discussed at the moment before we go into the mailbag?
No, I think we've talked about absolutely everything. I think, like, that's, again, just, I love this episode so much. I love this season so much. It's a delight. Yeah,
why people don't like it, season 8, I shall never know. One thing I do want to ask Cathy, if she's listening, which I know she is.
Hi, Cathy.
Is season 8, I think it's brilliant that out of the 11 episodes that we don't see much of Mulder, he is in this episode for all of like 20 seconds. I'm just wondering how much screen time Mulder actually has in the entirety of season 8, because he's meant to be, he appears in the 11 episodes, but he's not exactly in much, is he, really? But
no, and the way in which they use him is, I think, to the show's credit, it's very judicious, where it's like they understand that they need him in the premiere, even though Duchovny is busy off making Evolution or whatever. So it's like Duchovny isn't really in, like Mulder isn't really in Within or Without, but Duchovny is, because they know that they have to, like, they can't open the season premiere with absolutely no Mulder and no Duchovny, because they need to reassure audiences that, and again, a lesson that maybe hypothetically a later season of the show could have done well to learn from, which is that, like, you need to promise the audience what you can actually deliver. So if, for example, you were to open your season with, say, a stunt ass belonging to a prominent character that people loved, you might want to make sure that that character is actually going to appear at some point in the next, 11 or 12 or 13 or 19 episodes. But, like, Within and Without open with Duchovny as a way of telling the audience that, oh, don't worry, we're not stumbling blindly. We're not telling this story about Mulder missing without having Duchovny around and promising that he will turn up when we need to deliver on it. So I think that, like, the show's use of Duchovny is very judicious, even if that maybe doesn't lead to, like, the most Mulder per square inch in terms of, like, the 8th season. But I think it works out pretty well. Yeah. And, like, some of the Mulder stuff is my favorite. I do like late 8th season Mulder. I know Duchovny has, like, stated that he's not particularly, like, satisfied with his work there. I know that some fans are very critical of, like, how the character arc plays out or where the character arc goes. But I think that when Duchovny does show up in that final stretch, I think he's in, and I think the show uses him very, very well here.
There's interesting discussions to be had. I know that people will have that discussion.
Strong opinions. Strong opinions.
On Post Alive Mulder. Oh, spoiler. Oh, no.
Just see Post Dead Alive Mulder, which leaves everything open. It could be anything.
Exactly. He's just a walking zombie at this point. So let's dive into the mailbag then and see what the good old fans of the X-Files basement are talking about in there. Chris Henry says, a great episode. I love this stretch of mythology episodes. Probably the last good run of the show. I think we've already mentioned that as well. Carl Neer, a fantastic episode with brilliant music throughout and that heart-wrenching ending. Even though we knew it wasn't the end of Mulder, it was the most emotional thing with Scully screaming at the conclusion. X-Files was truly never as great afterwards as it was here, although the stretch of episodes to the end of the season were brilliant. So you've kind of had that mention there, saying that this is probably the last great episode.
I don't know if that's fair, but it's like I think it's the last time the show hits this high, yes, between at least now and the Morgan episodes of the revival.
The riding the wave of this towards the back end of season 8, is that the way you would maybe describe it? Yeah,
I think this is the peak of the wave. I think this is like the climax of it, and I think that it does, I think the 8th season, I don't know if I'm going to be back for the rest of the season, but I do think the 8th season lands the plane quite well, if even very well, all things considered, but I don't think it's ever as, like, emotionally powerful or striking as this is, in large part because when you get into the final 8 episodes, the plot starts happening.
Yeah.
And all that stuff that we mentioned at the start with the mythology in the 8th season starts kicking into gear. And that stuff is nowhere near as interesting as does Mulder want to be a dad?
Yeah.
You end up with the two kind of, like, they play into one another and they support one another, but they don't really cohere in a way that everything does here. Like, everything here just lines up perfectly. Whereas everything in the rest of the season just lines up really, really well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Definitely. I think the take essence, which I won't talk about too much because I think I am on that episode, but that is very much, X-Files does terminate.
You'll be giving your opinions a spin on that one, yeah?
Yeah.
It's verdigreat.
I am listening to you, Darren. I am listening to you. But we can only have so many puns per episode. We've got to be careful of the quota.
I don't want to get your back up.
Okay, Jessica, Miss Kelly, hard not to agree with AV Club's Emily St. James. It builds to such an expert tragedy. The direction at the end is pretty great and also appeals to what was already nostalgia for the show past this point. Just how did it get so epic and terrifying final from those wry, frumpy beginnings? I also like Jeremiah Smith and Absalom. Maybe the crazies are not crazies, as always, an interesting storyline. Non-ep related side notes, working on making my comments less long, sentence purpley, and more reader friendly. Chris Carter, I empathise. I needed to put that in there because I knew I was going to get some of her comment wrong there. I think the point about it being epic and nostalgic, you mentioned like the Star Wars thing. It is epic, but at the same time, it's the tragic epic. So I think it balances that really well.
No, I think it absolutely does. And I think that it manages to be, again, intimate and epic, where like the stakes of this are highly personal. Will this couple be reunited? And again, we talked about this in the podcast before. I know you are not a shipper. I am shipping agnostic. But the idea, like, I think on the 8th season, you have to buy into the idea that it's the story of these two people who, no matter what, need to be together. And the idea that even death cannot separate them, which is what this is not happening is at its core. And I think that it works really well because it does make that like personal story kind of epic. And again, it's because it's so pared back. As we said, there's no cigarette smoking man, there's no Krychek, there's no Kirsch. There's no real Jeremiah Smith is like the most recurring character we have here if we exclude, for example, Mitch Pileggi or kind of, anybody else there. But like or Skinner's assistant played by Arlene Pileggi. But you have the idea that, this is the most epic version of this intimate family drama imaginable, which I guess is kind of what the show has always been, in that, we talked about a lot when we talked about the mythology. We talked about the idea that it's about fathers and sons, two fathers and one son, perhaps one might say, but the idea that it is about generational stuff. It's about wrestling with your dad, again, like Star Wars. But the 8th season is very much about two people wanting to be together, or trying to figure out if they want to be together, if they can be together, and turning it into this epic sweeping narrative that is 20 hours long about how the universe is trying to separate the two of them. And again, as I said, death cannot part us, which is kind of amazing. And again, I do think there is something to be said for the fact that whatever problems, and I do have some problems with the fact the show continues after the end of the 8th season, I do like that the 8th season at its core is about the idea that, maybe the end for Mulder and Scully doesn't have to be death. It's a rejection of the idea of death. Instead, it's maybe they can live happily ever after. They can just have a different story than the one that we're following week in and week out. Because The X-Files, again, as we said, is a show that is in many ways about trauma and suffering and consequences and dealing with these terrible things. So maybe they can have a story that's different than that. So I like that, This Is Not Happening kind of pushes the two of them to the extreme, where it's what is the most X-Files story for Mulder and Scully? And it's Scully finds Mulder returned as an abductee, dead in a ditch in a field. That's the most X-Files ending of their relationship together. And I love that the show goes, no, we're going to push past that. So yeah, I completely agree with that epic comment there.
This is very rarely discussed as one of the best endings of the X-Files, but that's just me.
Kurt is Mulder should have stayed dead. We should just forget. They shouldn't have come back 5 weeks later. They should have just aired the lone gunman in the remainder of the 8 slots for season 8. Fans would have loved that.
Hey, tell you what, it probably would have been Soprano level finish then. That wouldn't it really?
Don't stop believing. Hold on to that feeling. I kind of want that shot of Scully shouting no, and then we just start playing Journey.
In a serious note, though, on the ending, the ending does remind me quite significantly of the end of The Red and the Black. I think it has that kind of feel to it. It has that going to that epicness of an ending or cliffhanger of an episode where it's it was Patient X, wasn't it? So the end of Patient X was just boom, and I think that this one has that same visceral, emotional, unrelenting.
Well, the cutting on the screaming, the cutting on the screaming, and it's this ends on Scully weeping, so it's not, it's very much it's, again, as you said, it's an emotional ending rather than a literal ending.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew Levitt, this is a long one. An excellent episode that gives us some insight into Scully's emotional journey to find Mulder. The narrative is compelling, with the return of the abductees from Requiem giving audiences hope that not only will Scully and Doggett find Mulder, but also that the return of Jeremiah Smith will save Mulder from imminent death, like he did for Teresa. It's a kick in the guts when he's abducted last minute, leaving Mulder dead. while Scully's emotional no at the end seems overblown and cartoonish, given how much the series tried to base itself in reality, is an effective way to establish her and the audience's distress at realising Mulder is dead and there's nothing she can do about it. The introduction of Monica Reyes is interesting, showing her as a quirky character who might be a believer in paranormal phenomena, but not the same mould as Mulder. Mark Snow's music is excellent throughout, being quiet and reflective in the emotional moments and bombastic in the final scene, reflecting the need for Scully to succeed in what audiences have been hoping for over the past half of a season. An excellent episode overall that really helps to bring so far somewhat stalled season-long mythology arc into focus. 9 out of 10. It was something I was going to bring up, but I saw this in the feedback before coming on. There is an argument to say that the no, this is not happening bit is a bit overblown. I don't subscribe to that, but I can see people having that reaction. What do you make to that kind of reaction to that moment?
Well, I mean, I do think that, like, first of all, I think it works in large part because it's you always get a great effect when a quiet character goes loud. When Scully is a character who is normally so restrained and so buttoned down, particularly when you compare it to, say, Duchovny. Like, we talked on this podcast before about Duchovny as one of the great ugly criers of television and how committed he is and how he will go there when he needs to. But Anderson, as we said, is generally a quieter, more reserved, more reactive performance. So having her go and have that big emotional moment is just incredible because it sells the stakes of what's happening. It sells the emotional kind of devastation of it. It's that moment where it all comes undone. It's the moment where, like, again, that thing that we talked about with Scully where she wants to find him, but she's also afraid to find him. She has all these things inside her that she cannot say. And again, that's something that continues even past this point as we talk about when, the way that Scully talks about her pregnancy, which I kind of love, by the way, that, like, the big mystery of, like, what is up with Scully's pregnancy is just Scully doesn't want to talk about it. Like, that's the resolution to it. Slight spoiler alert. But I love that, like, you have the moment where, like, Scully, and again, it's something that, and again, I worry I may be projecting too much onto this, but as somebody who has been accused of being introspective and buttoned down and kind of like somebody who doesn't always communicate with emotional clarity or emotional intensity when the situation calls for it, it's that moment of realizing that you will never get that moment to say all the things that you wanted to say, that all the stuff that you kept locked up inside yourself because you were expecting that at some point you would get a chance to let it out on your own terms and to say it and to make it real and to hold it and to confide it and to, like, for Scully to tell Mulder everything that she wants to tell him, everything that she needs to tell him. To have lost all of that is just to see it all kind of come undone. And I think Anderson's work is phenomenal, and I think that moment is earned. Now, I completely buy, just as I completely understand people who don't like Duchovny's, like, Hall of Fame ugly crying on television, where they're like, that's a bit much as well. I completely get that. It's a personal thing, but for me, that moment really works because it does feel earned. It feels like somebody who has been wound up so tight inside that they've been unable to even acknowledge these feelings that they have, let alone say them out loud, to just have them all pour out because they realize that they'll never get that chance because of something that they've always known was a possibility, if not a probability, of how this was going to end. I think that's an amazing dramatic payoff. I absolutely adore it. I no notes, Darren says. No notes.
Okay, next one is from somebody called Chris Knowles. A masterclass in late period X-Files episode writing wholly embraces the mythology's core elements with a sense of confidence unseen since season 5. David has been arguing for a number of years to expand the core cast, and I think the second half of the season proved him right. Yeah. So our good friend Chris Knowles there. Couple of things on that. The most confidence on mythology since series 5. Briefly mentioned that with the Patient X and Red and the Black. But and you mentioned a bit on the ensemble as well. So on this back end, so, as I say, with the ensemble, we've talked a little bit about that, but you want to expand a little bit more on what you think about the ensemble moving forward?
Well, I mean, that is the big thing about the X-Files. And again, like, it's one of those things where when you go back and you read interviews, particularly from Duchovny, I think Anderson was much more diplomatic in her interviews about the subject, but Duchovny, particularly like during the time in Vancouver where he was spending time away, particularly when he was spending time away from his wife at the time, Téa Leoni, and his young family. Like, that sort of stuff is a lot, and being asked to shoulder a television production. And again, this is one of the things where I worry I sound like an old man shaking my fist to the sky, but it's like, there's a reason why 20 episode a year or 26 episodes a year seasons of television are a lot rarer than they used to be. Why, you know, most networks now have, say, 20 episodes of CSI a year, or, you know, 20 episodes of NCIS a year or whatever. But even, say, things like, you know, even streaming shows like, say, Strange New Worlds will only do 10 episodes a year, or even shows like, say, Evil, which is still episodic and on Paramount Plus, will only do, I think, 13 episodes a year. Things like Hannibal on NBC cut down to 13 episodes a year, all that sort of stuff. And there's a reason for that, and that's because television production is very demanding, arguably more demanding than, say, movie production is, even if or perhaps because they're operating with a lower budget on a tighter schedule and with less chance to, like, do reshoots and pickups and improvements and things like that. And it's particularly the case when you get to something that has a small ensemble where everything is holding on the shoulders of two people. Like, so you look at a show like, say, Star Trek, where they're doing 26 episodes a year, at least they can rotate through a core cast of 8 people. And you'll notice that if you watch old Star Trek episodes, there are points at which, like, actors will disappear for 1 or 2 episodes at a time.
Like the Rick Berman stuff, isn't it? The Rick Berman block.
Yeah, the Rick Berman era stuff. Yeah. Like Colm Meaney would disappear from Deep Space Nine for 3 or 4 episodes in a given season because he'd go back to Ireland and make a movie, for example. Or, you know, like, you'd have episodes where Quark wouldn't appear for 1 or 2, or he'd only appear in a short scene at the start that he could bank, so that Armin Shimmerman was able to work on Buffy at the same time without having to go through all that makeup. And the idea of, like, having a large ensemble allows that. When you have 2 actors, particularly when you have 2 young actors, doing 20-odd episodes of this a year, and in particular doing a show where Mulder and Scully appear in most scenes of most episodes of the show, that is a tremendous amount of pressure to place on absolutely anybody. And I know that, like, you know, you can read Duchovny's interviews separated from context, separated from time, and he can come across as quite confrontational. He can probably come across to some readers as entitled when he talks about how tired and how angry he is and how he doesn't like working in Vancouver. And that was a big thing in Vancouver as well. We undoubtedly kind of covered it when we talked about the end of the 5th season. But things like, you know, the Duchovny Go Home signs that were put outside strip clubs in Vancouver, that sort of stuff, in reaction to him complaining about it on, I believe it was Conan, I think it was, where he kind of, like, gave an interview and he's like, Vancouver rains and it's depressing and it's dark and I'm away from my family all the time. And you understand why that is. And I think that, like, adding a larger ensemble to the X-Files is good because it lessens the pressure on any individual member of that team. And I think that in particular, as these actors are getting older, they've been doing it at this point for 8 years. Like, again, both Duchovny and Anderson have had families in the time that they have been working on this show. And as, like, anybody who has founded a family knows, it is incredibly difficult to find time for that when you are working and coming home at the end of the day, let alone when you are working in a literal different country from the country where your family lives. That is very hard, and it's very exhausting, and it's very draining. And so having a larger ensemble, having characters like Mitch Pileggi, characters like Walter Skinner, characters like Doggett, characters like Reyes provisionally as well, who can, like, shoulder that burden. And so you can do things like let Gillian Anderson visit her daughter, I think, while her daughter's on midterm, because the shooting schedule lines up. That means a lot. That has a lot of value. And I think it makes the set a nicer place to be. In fact, there's a lot of coverage. Again, Eat the Corn, a fantastic website, well worth seeking out, fantastic resource. But it has a whole host of interviews from the start of the 8th season, where you have a variety of people talking on background on these interviews about how, like, broadening the ensemble, bringing in Robert Patrick, making Pileggi kind of a team player, helped make the atmosphere on set a lot healthier than it had been during, like, the, you know, tumultuous 7th season. And how, like, having the ability to do episodes without particular characters or without particular actors, to give them light weeks or weeks off, meant that the show kind of just had more freedom and had more range, and even dramatically, right? And I know I know that this is going to upset some fans, and they are probably right, given the fate of the show, that, you know, whether or not the X-Files can survive without Mulder and Scully, or whether the X-Files just is Mulder and Scully. But the argument that even when you have a more diverse cast, you have more interesting combinations. So things like, for example, the episode kind of with is it Vienna with Doggett and Mulder on the oil rig together, which is like, it's just such an interesting combination because you couldn't do that episode with Mulder and Scully. The dynamic would be fundamentally different if you tried to do it with Mulder and Scully, for example, but you can't. And so like that sort of stuff, it gives you a bit of room to play with, and it gives you a bit of, like, it allows you to make things kind of interesting and to try new combinations of characters. So yeah, no, it is arguably more of an ensemble piece. And again, you could argue this is very similar to what happened with Star Trek, when the original Star Trek was like a 3-man show, arguably a 2-man show, where it was Spock and Kirk. And then you could argue McCoy was the third part of that trilogy, although not really. But what happens is, after Leonard Nimoy decides that he doesn't want to play Spock and gets himself killed off in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, if you watch Star Trek III is the first time that Star Trek really feels like an ensemble where everybody in that cast gets something to do. I mean, like, Uhura gets the Mr. Adventure sequence. Sulu gets the Don't Call Me Tiny sequence. All that sort of stuff. Like, you have McCoy is, like, wandering around getting into bar fights, for example. Like, the cast really feels like an ensemble for the... Oh, Scotty gets to, like, sabotage the Excelsior. For the first time, without Spock as, like, the center of attention or the center of gravity, the show actually gets to be an ensemble. These characters actually get to be characters, and the show continues to benefit from that. You'll notice, for example, there are far more Sulu, Uhura, and Scotty moments and Chekhov moments in Star Trek 4 and Star Trek 6 than there were in Star Trek 1 or arguably Star Trek 2 as well. Because once you've figured out that those actors can do that, it gives you a tool or a string you can put in the banjo. So that's my very roundabout answer of saying, I think that, yeah, I like that the ensemble grows, and I think it was necessary. Yeah,
and I like the fact we've circled back around to the Wrath of Khan and Absalom, which is a perfect way to end. There is one final thing that's not... well, there is an element of this regarding Annabeth Gish and the character of Reyes. I think it's something that we definitely will come back to, but I'll just quickly go through this because I mentioned.
Are you looking for a smoking gun?
Yeah,
are you
looking for the smoking gun. I can't. So Paige Scheckter's been on and said I can't improve on what was being said before. Just now, I've started to wonder whether her smoking of Morley's was prescient. It's like someone set the first stone down a gravel path of her fate to the revival. And I would suggest that anyone who wants to look into this, look for this episode and go onto the basement, because there's a couple of more conversations within this episode, within this conversation. But Cathy and Cortlan start talking about this actual scene with the smoking. And Cortlan does retort back at one point saying that it's reasonable to think anyone who has the capacity to choose a path, that even Mulder and Scully have that capacity to choose the path. They've been tempted at various points.
Well, I mean, you could argue that, like, Mulder's his sunflower seed obsession is like an oral fixation that's, you know, slightly different than smoking. That maybe if he didn't have the seeds, he'd smoke. Yeah,
potentially. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a one that they'll definitely talk about. But yeah, what do you think? Just actually with regards to this episode, the fact that they went with the Morley lights as a character element.
I mean, I do find it odd that she just litters. Like that's how she's introduced. That's how the character is introduced, as somebody who litters. And like, again, and smoking, which is something that carries a great deal of symbolic weight within the X-Files. Again, there's a reason why the cigarette smoking man is arguably the third lead of the show. I am sorry, Skinner, but you didn't get to be on the cover of TV Guide, as far as I'm aware. You weren't called Your Generation's Darth Vader. So it is impossible, I think, to escape the fact that she has introduced smoking, and that was definitely a choice that was made consciously, and it was a choice that was made being fully aware of the symbolism that it carries. On the other hand, I do not buy that this was like setting up a Chekhov's gun or a Chekhov's smoking gun that like Carter was putting in place to pay off in the second season of a revival that would air in like 2017 or 18. When did season 11 air?
2018 was. I think it was January 2018.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that kind of tracks. But I do think it adds an interesting kind of layer of complexity. I do think it's perhaps more tied symbolically to the imagery of death. that kind of runs through it. Because again, cigarettes, particularly in the late 90s after, this was the couple of years after the release of The Insider, but cigarettes were tied to the idea of like death and kind of sickness and terminal disease. So that would be more, if you're asking me in the context of this episode, pretending that I know not what is to come. I'd be more like, are we making that connection with Reyes, who's this kind of, again, this figure who's introduced standing alone on top of a hill, staring out at a blue sky, surrounded by dead shrubs, smoking a cigarette. I'm like, that imagery all suggests death to me. It's all about, like, it's just the episode setting the table and, like, setting up this idea that this is a story that is going to be about death. To me, that's my reading. I mean,
And what a lovely way to finish the episode.
It's all about death,
all about hope.
Kurt. It's all about
hope or death. So that concludes the episode. So thank you again, Darren, for coming on. I'd say
thank you for having me.
I don't think you are on towards the back end of this season. I'm not sure, but you will be back. We're not going to let you get away that easily.
I like that. You're going to point a gun at my head and force me to talk about the ninth season.
And then make you force feed you some Morleys and it'll be fine.
You have me underneath. That's what you have me down for, underneath?
Yeah, potentially. You never know. But if people wanted to see or hear more of you, where can people find you online?
All right, so I co-host a podcast with my good friend Andrew Quinn called The 250. Andrew recently got married, so our schedule has been a little lackadaisical. We are making it up as we go, so we won't necessarily know what we have coming out. I will try and predict to the best of my ability what is coming up. So if you are listening as a Patreon, this is dropping, I believe, on the 22nd of July. So with that weekend, we will hopefully be covering Jai Bhim, which is the Indian film that is on Amazon. Just came into the 250. It's a relative new entry from a couple of years ago. Don't know anything about it, so can't offer you any teasers about it, but I'm very excited about it. But next week, myself and Andrew are covering all 4 films in the Jaws franchise with the fantastic Emma Kiley joining us. So on Monday, we'll be talking about Jaws. Tuesday, we'll be talking about Roy Scheider returning in Jaws 2, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. On Thursday, we'll be talking about Jaws 3D, which is a quote, and I quote, a new dimension in terror. And then on Friday, Michael Caine will be taking a holiday in the Bahamas and winning an Oscar in Jaws the Revenge, as well as apparently buying a very nice house. If you are not listening on the Patreon, so they'll be releasing on Friday the 5th of August, we will be releasing The Sound of Music, I desperately, desperately hope, with the fantastic Shiva McQuinn joining us for that discussion. We hope you'll join us for that. Otherwise, you can find me online. I'm at The Escapist Magazine, where I do a column called In the Frame, where I talk about, every Monday and every Friday, I talk about something in pop culture that is kind of interest. I do a host of reviews there. I do episode recaps for shows like, for example, Westworld, Strange New Worlds, all that sort of stuff there as well, if you want to check that out. I'm also available on Twitter at Darren_Mooney. If you want to come on and talk to me about how wrong I am about something or anything, I'm always kind of thrilled to hear it. But more than that, it is good to kind of talk and engage with people online. So feel free to give me a shout or a follow if you want there as well. Cheers.
Okay.
And I have a book out. I should mention that because the publishers don't like it when I forget that. I have a book out. It's The Black Archive, covering Kill the Moon, which is a Doctor Who episode. You can order that online from Amazon, from anywhere where books are available. Sorry, apologies.
Absolutely fine. No, and you have another book about Christopher Nolan and a book about something called The X-Files as well. Just to put that in there. Yes, so find me on Twitter at rmuldrake. It's RMULDRAKE. You'll find out what I'm up to in there. Whether it be on the podcast, and I have started recently doing a little bit of a YouTube channel myself. That is in it.
I did talk about Westworld.
We're talking about Westworld, yes. So yes, I am on there. That is something I'm hoping to develop. I've got a really good idea for something in the future, which I'm developing at the moment, which might start kicking in October. So feel free to have a look at that. I'll have more information on that as we air for future episodes. But best place to find me is on Twitter. But thank you very much, Darren, for joining us again for another Season 8 entry. It's been marvellous, as always.
Been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me, and sorry for keeping you for so long.
Fine.
This is why you only have me on in small doses.
Exactly. I don't know what the temperature's like now, but we'll check.
30 degrees and 29, so 29 and 30. So I've managed to raise the temperature by 5 degrees and by 2 degrees.
Well, I've only got one fan and one thermostat, and it's saying it's 28 degrees. So you are hot. You are equivocally hotter than I am. And that is now an official seal stamp of approval. And, Sarah can choose whichever bald eagle she likes, but you are the hotter one.
I think it's going to be Skinner. It's always going to be Skinner.
It is always going to be Skinner, without a doubt.
Just let me put some clothes on. I'll be right there. Let me put some clothes on.
Okay, until next time, thank you for everyone for listening. As always, it's happened.
Hey guys, my name is Tony Black, podcaster and author, and I'm here to tell you about Partisan, a podcast about politics and history in film and entertainment. I'll be joined by guests as we discuss films, TV shows, and maybe a little bit more, examining political and historical topics, such as how Elvis intersects with black cultural history.
In Lerman's film, the idea of the black characters are maybe they're used as catalysts to basically move Elvis forward in his career. I think that's how I saw it.
The rise and fall of Richard Nixon.
It seems to be historians seem to agree with this, is that he was the first president that really capitalized on the evangelical vote and politicized them.
The disturbing class satire in society and much, much more. Partisan is free to download on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast app of choice, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Pod. I hope you'll vote with your feet and join us on the journey.
The Xcast and X-Files podcast was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the Xcast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.